people that just have a propensity towards violent behavior. If you were kind of raised in that gang culture, that's your first instinct.
He was taking matters into his own hand and wanted street justice.
She was a mother of 4 who loved her kids. She had dreams. Those dreams were dashed because of revenge.
On the evening of August 19th, 2011, police in Atlanta, Georgia get a frantic 911 call.
I'm calling the police.
Atlanta 911 emergency operator 44.
Send the police to Macon Drive. And they had a drive-by and somebody got shot.
Okay.
And send the ambulance.
We received a call that a female was shot on Macon Drive.
And we're coming, okay? Tell me exactly what happened.
Witnesses report that a Tahoe had come up to the scene. A weapon was discharged from the rear seat, and that after the shooting occurred, the vehicle sped off.
The victim is 22-year-old Julian Jones, still alive, but bleeding badly from a leg wound.
No, I have mercy. Please tell me to hurry.
The commotion gets the attention of Julian's aunt, who lives next door.
I was in the house, cleaning up, vacuuming, and everything. And that's when I heard the gunshots. Not knowing it was in front of my door, outside the house. So I looked at the window, and my neighbor was yelling for me to come outside. Pierre got shot. And I went to see her laying there, blood coming out. She was screaming, "Auntie, I'm hurt, I'm hurt." It was just hard to see her laying on there. The ambulance, I don't even know what took them so long. They took a long time to get there. But once they got there, they put her in on the stretcher and took her away.
For those left behind at the chaotic scene, the question is why anyone would shoot her in the first place.
Everybody loved her, man. I mean, to know her was to love her. She just was entrenched in that community. Just a loving young lady who cared for her family and was trying to be a good mother to her 4 children.
Julian Jones was born on September 10th, 1988, at Atlanta's Grady Hospital.
Julian Jones is her biological name, but everybody in the neighborhood call her P. Well, her aunt call her P. She had so many nicknames.
I call her Pee-Pie because when she was a little bitty baby, she always slept with one eye open and one eye closed. So I just said, okay, Pee-Pie.
Julian and her brother, Christopher, their biological mother is our oldest sister. June adopted both of them when they was young, when they was babies.
I got Julian when she was 2 days old. She came straight from the hospital. And I already had Chris, and I had Chris ever since he was 2 months old. And I raised them 2 together, and oh my God. Hard times, it was hard times, but we all got through it.
They lived in what was sometimes a rough neighborhood, but June did her best to raise the kids to be joyful and feel loved. Unlike most kids, Julian liked to help out around the house.
She learned how to cook. 'Cause I used to do Sunday dinner every Sunday. We all used to get together at my house and eat dinner and just have a ball, just have a good time laughing.
Julian loved to cook, but I had to go to work. So she thought that she was going to be the lady of the house and cook for her siblings.
As she grew up, Julian's bright personality made her popular in the area.
They call her Princess of Macon Drive because she was the only girl up there. Everybody else were boys. So she was the little princess of Macon Drive.
She was especially close with 2 boys, Jalen and Xavier.
All 3 of them grew up like sisters and brothers. They had no problem with each other.
Julian, she talks to you about any and everything. She fun. She loves to dance. She loves to sing.
But as Julian and her brother got older, they wanted a little more freedom.
Eventually, Chris came to move with me, so Julian. She eventually left June and came to me, too. All the kids wind up coming to me in their teenager years. They know I was linear boy, so I worked all the time, and they could do what they wanted to do at my house, and they couldn't do that at June's house.
Julian was a bright girl with an even brighter future, but it was put on hold when she got pregnant her sophomore year of high school. Thankfully, her aunts were there to help her raise the baby.
She went to get her GED at the workforce building.
The girl was so happy about that, and then see her auntie there with her. Oh, she was so happy. She got her GED.
Around this time, Julian also fell in love with a young man named Adonis.
They was okay. They had a good relationship. They loved each other. She had kids by him.
Within a few years, Julian and Adonis added 3 more kids to their family.
She was a good mother. She worked for them, and at every event, she's always there.
She tried to teach her kids how to dance. You know that song, Beef It Up? That's one of her favorite songs. And I was like, oh my God. So we all in the room just beefing it up, dancing. And I said, Joy, you is so funny.
Julian's children were everything to her, but she still had other dreams as well.
And she used to be in there all the time, over your shoulder. What you cooking now? She wanted to go to Cornell Art School. She wanted to be a cook. Oh my God, a cook.
Now, all of it is in jeopardy, and Julian is fighting for her life.
My mom had called me and told me about Julian. She said Julian been shot. So I got in my car and I did 90 miles an hour over there to see what was going on. By the time I got there, the ambulance and the fire truck was already there. And they told me to just don't get out my car, just follow them down to the hospital.
The investigators know that drive-by shootings are often gang-related.
The Macon Drive area has historically been known as a pretty violent area. We've seen a lot of gang activity increased over the years.
There are gang members there who operate daily. They commit a lot of crimes. They are responsible for a lot of the shootings.
The murder took place off of Cleveland Avenue. It's in the metro part of Atlanta. It's kind of south a little bit, and it's a known area for a criminal street gang known as Raised on Cleveland.
They basically was a group of young men that was raised on Cleveland Avenue. They aligned themselves with a blood gang, but they were not a traditional blood gang. We call them hybrid gangs, where they will take on the symbolization of a traditional gang, but they were not tied to them.
The people you find in these gangs don't have anything to do and nowhere to go. You do something to these guys, they will shoot you and not even think about it.
And it's all about the guns, all about the violence. It's nothing about fist fight like we used to in the olden days, or beating somebody up and they going home crying. It ain't nothing like that now. You get an attitude, bam, you shot and dead.
While doctors attempt to save Julian Jones after a drive-by shooting, investigators try to determine what happened. Witnesses say Julian was outside talking to her friend Jalen when the shooting happened.
They were chopping it up in the neighborhood, and a black Tahoe came driving by very slowly. The backseat passenger behind the driver's seat rolled down his window and literally pulled out a gun and started firing. Of course, Jalen ran, and unfortunately, P-Pop got shot.
After the shooting occurred, the vehicle sped off.
None of the witnesses claimed to have seen the shooter or the driver well enough to ID them, so investigators searched the scene for forensic evidence.
We wound up blocking off the area around Macon Drive where the incident occurred. Our investigators were really methodical in their approach because Ms. Jones was moved from the actual scene, so we actually had to retrace her steps. We found some blood evidence from Miss Julian Jones from when she was actually struck. A round ricocheted off of something and wound up hitting her in the femoral artery. What happens is that you'll have an impact strike, for instance, if it hits the ground, the bullet will change directions. And sometimes it'll change directions with the same force that it does from the point when it hits the ground. We had some shell casings from what we thought was an AR-15 at the time, and then ballistic evidence ultimately confirmed that. The projectiles that we were able to recover from the scene was a .223, which is usually an indication that an AR-15 was used.
As a reporter here in Atlanta, I've covered many cases where AR-15s are used to kill people. This is like stock for gang members. When they shoot people, they want to kill them. They want to shoot multiple times, they want to get off quick fire, and they want to get away.
As authorities keep working the scene and start looking for Jalen, Julian's loved ones pray for good news at the hospital.
We were sitting down there waiting and waiting. And I was hoping that, she was gonna make it home, but she was just gonna have something wrong with her legs or she was gonna be paralyzed. But when they told me that she was dead, I just couldn't control myself. I just lost it. They wouldn't let me see her because they said that it was an ongoing investigation. And I wanted to see my baby because I didn't want her to go out like that.
That was my baby. What I'm gonna do without her? That was my friend.
The case has become a homicide, and Julian's loved ones think they know who did it.
As we began to question some of our family members, we got information about the potential for domestic violence occurring with respects to her relationship.
The family shares details about Julian's boyfriend, Adonis.
He started mistreating her. I don't know what went on in their relationship or what caused the mistreating and everything, but I know she wasn't happy anymore. And she moved back home with me. And then this happened.
Having been the homicide commander in many deaths related to domestic violence, it's been my experience that at least 15% of all cases come from intimate partners.
The princess of Macon Drive is murdered. She's no longer with us. The community is in an uproar. They want to know who did this. Police, they have to look at Adonis, the father of Julian's children. Did he kill her?
Within days of the drive-by murder of Julian Jones, investigators tracked down her ex-boyfriend, Adonis.
Police took a hard look at Adonis. Was he the person who killed Julian?
We were able to eventually identify Adonis, the father of her children, and he provided a statement.
Adonis admits that their relationship was volatile, but insists he'd never do anything to hurt her.
Him and Peapod probably had kind of a roller coaster relationship. There were some ups and downs, but they were trying to work it out and do their thing and raise their kids as best they could. He may have been verbally abusive. I don't recall any physical abuse.
It was just like they was getting mad at each other. They was yelling, they was screaming, they was hollering. I tried to intervene, but sometimes you just can't. Eventually, Julian got tired of it, so Julian wanted to move on, and she wanted to see other people, and she wanted to upgrade her life and get herself together and all of that, and take care of her children.
Adonis claims he and Julian remained friends after their breakup. He says he gave her a ride to her aunt's house a little while before she was shot, which means he admits to being in the area at the time.
But they began investigating, looked deeper into this case, and they checked out his alibis, and they cleared him in Julian's murder.
What we found during the course of our investigation at the end of the day is that he was inside the house dealing with the kids.
With their best suspect eliminated, investigators head back out into the neighborhood looking for new leads. But they quickly run into a problem.
In some neighborhoods, there's this prevailing sense of not snitching to the police. As you can imagine, some witnesses simply weren't cooperating. One of the things that we work really hard to do is to build this sense of trust in many of our communities. Well, as you can imagine, in an area where there's a lot of crime and there's heavy police enforcement, you have a lot more work to do.
Thankfully, Julian's aunt, April Howe, finds a way to serve as a liaison for police.
I wasn't questioning people. I wasn't going the door to door. I'm Auntie April in the neighborhood, so of course they came to me.
Word on the street is that the bullet that killed her niece was intended for someone else, Julian's childhood friend, Jalen.
Once I learned Jalen was involved, it was all told by the people in the neighborhood, and we talked about it. And I shared with the detective.
April reports that people are saying Jalen and his brother Xavier, both members of the Raised on Cleveland, or Rock Crew, robbed a wealthy basketball player 4 months ago.
He was robbed of about $55,000 worth of jewelry outside of the barbershop. It was a crime of opportunity at that point. Right after, it appears that he had gone into the barbershop to question some of the individuals in there about the identity of the persons that robbed him when he lost his jewelry. The people in the barbershop was able to give him like a loose description of the individuals and possibly some nicknames.
And the basketball player's hunt for revenge gained notoriety around the neighborhood.
Everybody knew that, hey, this is the basketball player in his 4-door Porsche, and ultimately he's got a gun. And he's looking for the folk that were part of the Rock Crew who robbed him.
April tells detectives she heard that the man tracked down Jalen that fateful night to get revenge.
He was firing at Jalen, and that's how Julian got shot. I was upset. I wanted to blame Jalen, because if it weren't for Jalen, my baby wouldn't have been shot, regardless of whether she was outside or not. She would have never been shot.
After a drive-by shooting that claimed the life of Julian Jones, Atlanta police are searching for her friend Jalen, a gang member who might have been the intended target. Ordinarily, no one would talk to the cops, but Julian is no ordinary victim.
Most gang members, there's a code where they're not going to come and communicate to law enforcement officials because they just assume deal with it in their way as well. But at some point, the community put so much pressure on Jalen to come in because Peapod meant something to that community. So he eventually comes in and he says what happened.
Come to find out, it all started with Big Boo.
Big Boo was one of the leaders of the rock crew. He was an older guy. Well, he was older than many of the members of the rock crew because I think Big Boo was in his late 20s, early 30s. But he had been around the block a while. He was an older guy. And so he had a lot of influence over those young minds and over the young men that were a part of Raised on Cleveland. And so on the night in question, Big Boo was the one who set up the robbery at the barbershop.
According to Jalen, their mark was a former pro basketball player named Javaris Crittenden, a local legend in the Atlanta area. And Jalen says Javaris is the one who shot from the Chevy Tahoe, killing Julian Jones.
Javaris was a star player at Southwest Atlanta Christian Academy. Won a couple of championships, state championships. Star player. And he was no slouch in the classroom. He had a 3.5 grade point average in high school. His future was bright. And then he goes to Georgia Tech. Only played a year, but in the year he was there, he became a leader. This was a freshman who was a leader on this senior Layton team. He declared for the NBA after a year. The local paper named him the Georgia Basketball Player of the Year. He was just an outstanding athlete. And at the time, as far as we knew, he was an outstanding person. Javaris gets drafted by the Lakers in the first round. This is a huge deal. So he gets to lovely LA, and according to prosecutors, what does he do? He joins a gang. Now, Javaris said he wasn't a member of the gang, that he just hung around them for protection. But what about that tattoo on your stomach? It's a Crips tattoo there.
Soon after, Crittenden's career began to falter. He was traded several times to different teams and eventually got into an explosive argument with another player.
He joined the Washington Wizards. Of course, the marquee player there was Gilbert Arenas. And at some point, they got into an altercation there inside the locker room. And there were allegations that guns were involved and that they drew guns on one another.
He was getting all the attention, all the love, but for some reason, we have yet to figure out, he sought a different kind of attention. You know, he danced around the edges of the law. He hung with people who had questionable character. He just wasn't willing to walk the straight and narrow and improve his chances of success. Instead, he shot his chances for success in the foot.
In 2009, Crittenden was released by the Wizards. Over the next 2 years, he briefly played in China and then for a minor league team before eventually returning home to Atlanta. Police learned that in addition to the barbershop robbery, Crittenden was robbed at gunpoint at least 3 other times.
I'm Lance 911 emergency operator 2784. May I help you?
I'd like to report a robbery.
There was one robbery in the West End where he was taking a friend home from a club. When he stopped, then guys jump out and rob him.
Javaris, he wore expensive jewelry. And in some of these neighborhoods, that's not a smart thing to do. You become a target as this big athlete, a strong guy. That has to wound the pride, if you will.
For whatever reason, he kept going back to that community, and every time he went back there, he was victimized by a robbery. And I think that began to anger him. And so it was his position to go back and get revenge on the individuals that made him a victim in the first place. And it was at that point that Mr. Crittenden began to drive throughout the Macon Drive community with a shotgun in his lap.
In these communities, you're expected to be tough. You are expected to exact revenge when someone wounds you, when someone hurts you, when someone takes your manhood, if you will. And that's what these robberies are in some of these guys' eyes. You're attacking my manhood, and you don't do that. So their only recourse is to fight back or shoot back.
Police think this is what Crittenden decided to do after Jalen allegedly robbed him at the barbershop.
Javaris was taking matters into his own hand and wanted street justice. He was going after any and everybody that was associated with Jalen and wanted to make a point to the rock crew that if you mess with Javaris Crittenden, he's going to hunt you down in a way that is not going to be friendly. And you may be looking on the other side of a 223.
Atlanta police believe Javaris Crittenden is the man who shot Julian Jones during a botched revenge hit on a gang member. But when they go to arrest him at his home in Fayetteville, Georgia, they discover he's on the run.
We have to take our steps to try to find him. And so that wasn't the easiest of things, but developing him as a potential suspect in the case, it became really important that we needed to sit down and talk with him.
There was a massive manhunt for Javaris. The police department even had the FBI assisting them in trying to get him into custody.
As the search continues, police seek evidence to connect Crittenden to the murder.
Witnesses reported seeing a rental symbol on the back of the Tahoe. So we called around and we asked if Javaris Crittenden had rented a Chevy Tahoe at that particular location. And, one after another, they tell you, no, we don't have that name in our database. And then after you make so many phone calls, you start thinking to yourself that you're just chasing a ghost. You make that last phone call and the person said, yeah, well, we did have a Javaris Crittenden that rented a Chevy Tahoe that's a hybrid model from our business. We picked up the vehicle, got a search warrant for it, and I directed them to swab it for gunpowder residue. And right where witnesses put Mr. Crittenden, we got a positive hit for gunpowder residue in the top part of that vehicle, directly where Mr. Crittenden was sitting.
You had Javaris Crittenden's fingerprint on the inside door behind the driver's seat. And so all of what Jalen told us was consistent with the physical evidence.
It's enough for investigators to get a search warrant for Crittenden's home.
While we executed the search warrant at his property, we found the Porsche, but the AR-15 itself, I don't believe we ever found that weapon. We found a shotgun that the witnesses had reported. The investigation really snowballed from that point.
The rental agency also gives detectives a copy of the rental agreement. Crittenden's name is on it, along with another man, Douglas Gamble.
I found out he's actually the cousin, but they're more like brothers. And he supported whatever Javaris did. They spent most of their time with each other, traveled with each other.
Investigators get warrants for Crittenden and Gamble's phone GPS records, which reveal something that suggests Crittenden knew that police used these records to tie people to crimes.
At the time that Peapod was shot, Javaris's phone was completely off. Because his phone is off, it doesn't tie him to the scene. It's not communicating with the tower. We didn't believe that ultimately Javaris just happened upon this information.
A further look into Javaris's past reveals how he might have learned that criminal strategy.
And so our investigation led us to Los Angeles. And lo and behold, the same type of murder Javaris's name comes up in. There was this beef going on, an inner Crip beef, and it ultimately ended up killing a young lady. She she was actually pregnant with a child, and she died as well as her baby there on the scene. Javaris's name came up in that because his phone was in the area. He wasn't a gunman, but he was in the area. He knew how this gang actually rented a car, and so he was instructed about how to go about killing Jalen from this murder.
Javar seems to have applied what he learned about renting cars and turning phones off from the shooting in LA.
But his cousin didn't know well enough to turn his phone off, and apparently Javaris didn't share the news.
Douglas Gamble's phone goes to the area right around the exact same time the 911 call came out, within minutes of the 911 call. His phone is using a cell tower that's probably with about a mile and a half from the crime scene. Douglas Gamble's phone leaves the crime scene around that time, and then it goes traveling the west side of Atlanta. Javaris Crittenton's phone pops back on the grid, and now it starts to use cell towers that are not far from the same cell towers that Douglas Gamble was using.
Investigators now have enough evidence to get an arrest warrant for Gamble, too. Gamble is arrested and charged with murder, and Crittenton's LA connection finally gives police a lead on where to find him as well.
As we began to dig into his gang affiliation, we realized that he had posted bail for some gang members out in Los Angeles.
We found and were able to track down that he had purchased a one-way ticket to LA from Atlanta, and that he was going to fly out on like the red eye.
On August 29, 2011, the LAPD and the FBI arrest Javaris Crittenton at John Wayne Airport and extradite him back to Fulton County.
Ultimately, he was charged with murder. He was charged with a gang statute here in the state of Georgia, which is one of the strongest statutes in the country, along with possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony.
So we started to prepare the case for indictment. And of course, the case was indicted. And once the case was indicted, we were preparing for trial.
To everyone's surprise, however, a judge releases Javaris Crittenton on a $230,000 bond, despite strong opposition from Julian Jones's family.
No, you don't need to get out. You don't need to get out on bond because you kill someone. You can be a flight risk. You already ran to LA after the murder. So how could you run to LA and then think if we set you on a bond, you won't fly again?
Nearly 3 years pass while prosecutors prepare their case against Javaris Crittenton and Douglas Gamble. The whole time, Crittenton has remained free on bail, but he can't seem to stay out of trouble.
While Javaris is out on bond, police say he's involved in the manufacturing and selling of multi-kilos of cocaine and marijuana. They say him and at least 13 other people were involved in this massive operation to buy and distribute these drugs around the community. Keep in mind, this guy is out on bond on a murder charge, and he's involved in something just as big.
Crittenton is rearrested, and police seize over 900 pounds of cocaine. This time, a judge refuses bail.
People were wondering, what is Javaris thinking? Is he really who we thought he was? It was just further evidence of his downward spiral.
In April 2015, Crittenton and Gamble are set to stand trial for the murder of Julian Jones.
I wanted to see some sign of remorse, but I saw this steel-ish character, this strong and defiant and tough guy sitting there.
He was being like he higher than everybody else. No remorse, no sympathy.
Everybody knew that Jalen had robbed him and the rock crew had robbed him. But at the end of the day, he found out ultimately where Jalen stayed, and unfortunately, Julian Jones was killed because of it.
Usually when you cover one of these trials, there's a buzz because there's a jury and the trial is about to start. But this day, that buzz was extra loud because I didn't know what was going on. I was like, wow, what's happening? All of this anxiety, this anticipation, ready for this jury to start, and then all of a sudden, it stops.
Just before opening statements begin, Crittenden changes his plea to guilty.
The district attorney's office had agreed to reduce the charge of murder to voluntary manslaughter. And they had agreed to sentence him to a 20-year deal.
A plea? A plea for what? No, he don't need to do no plea. I guess I was the spokesperson for my family. No, he didn't need to do no plea. We couldn't do no plea. But when we went back in there, the judge came down with a verdict.
They were devastated. I could see the look on their faces, and I still see that look. And from time to time, even when speaking to June Woods and April.
Javaris Crittenden pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter and aggravated assault.
I think, his lawyer whispered in his ear, it's as good as it's going to get. And the risk is too great for him, because I think his lawyer knew that in the end, he would have been convicted of murder and he would have been serving a life sentence.
They sentenced Javaris 23 years in prison and 17 on probation or parole when he come home. Man, I think he should have got life. I mean, I don't want to be mean and harsh or anything like that, but you killed someone. You knew what you was doing. You took the wrong life, even though she wasn't your intended target. You still killed her.
Douglas Gamble pleads guilty to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and earns 3 years in prison.
When I think about this case, I really dwell on Julian Jones, and I try to think about April and June Woods and Julian Jones' kids.
She put them to sleep at night, woke them up to get ready for school. Somebody else has to take care of that task. And you gotta know that they have a hole in their heart, will have one for the rest of their lives because of the actions of Javaris Crittenden and him wanting revenge.
It's about decisions. And so, had he made some different decisions and allowed himself to just breathe and take a step back and let law enforcement officials deal with it, then I think you have a different outcome in this case.
If he would.
On the morning of April 26, 1999, Jill Dando woke up as she always did, as a woman whose face was familiar to millions of people. She was 37 years old. To strangers, she belonged to the television screen. She was a woman with the bright smile, the calm voice, the reassuring presence who could walk into the darkest stories of Britain and somehow make them feel understandable. She had become one of the BBC's most recognizable presenters, a familiar figure in living rooms across the country. But on this particular morning, none of that mattered. Not the television career, not the cameras, not the millions of viewers who knew her name. Because by the end of the day, Jill Dando would be dead, and the person who killed her would disappear. There would be no dramatic confrontation in front of witnesses, no chase through the streets of London, no gunman caught on camera, no confession waiting at the end of an interrogation room. There would simply be a woman returning home, a front door, a single gunshot, and then silence. The strange thing about some murders is that they begin with something almost painfully ordinary, a journey home, a familiar street, a key in a hand. The final few steps toward a place where a person expects to be safe. That was how Jill Dando's final moments began. She had been out that day and was returning to her home in Fulham, West London. The neighborhood was not some remote wilderness where a person might disappear without anyone noticing. It was an urban environment surrounded by homes, roads, and the ordinary movement of London life. Yet somewhere between the outside world and the doorway of her own home, Jill's life intersected with a killer. The attack was brutally simple. She was shot once in the head at very close range. There was no prolonged struggle, no opportunity to run, no warning that anyone could see. One moment, Jill Dando was approaching her home. The next, she was dying. The person responsible was gone. And almost immediately, one of the most bewildering murder investigations in modern British history had begun. But there was something else that made this case different. The victim was not an unknown woman whose disappearance might take days to attract attention. Jill Dando was famous. She was a BBC presenter. She had become particularly associated with Crime Watch, a program built around the public's help in identifying criminals. She was someone whose professional life revolved around murder investigations, missing people, suspects, and unsolved crimes. She had spent years asking viewers to look carefully, to remember faces, to notice details, to come forward if they knew something. Now she had become the victim at the center of a murder investigation of her own. The irony was almost unbearable. A woman who had spent her career helping Britain search for killers had been murdered outside her own front door. And whoever did it seemed to plan their escape just as carefully as they had planned the attack. At first, investigators had a crime scene. But a crime scene is not the same thing as an explanation. There was a body. There was a weapon. There were physical traces. There were questions. But there was no obvious answer to the most important question of all. Why Jill Dando? Why her? Why that moment? Why that location? And perhaps most importantly, who had been waiting for her? The first hours after murder are often filled with certainty. Police officers establish boundaries. Photographs are taken. Evidence is collected. Witnesses are sought. Names begin appearing in notebooks. People are asked where they were, what they saw, what they heard. The machinery of an investigation begins moving. But beneath all of that activity is something investigators cannot photograph. A gap. The gap between the last moment the victim was alive and the moment the police arrived. That gap is where a killer exists. For Jill Dando, that gap would remain stubbornly difficult to close. The investigators would eventually examine countless possibilities. They would look at people who knew Jill, people who might have encountered her, people who might have become obsessed with her, people whose behavior seemed strange, people whose stories appeared suspicious. And eventually, one man would become the focus of the entire investigation. His name was Barry George. But that name did not begin this story. Jill Dando did. And before the newspapers, before the courtroom, before the arguments over forensic evidence, before the conviction and the eventual acquittal, there was simply a woman walking home. That is where the mystery begins. Imagine the scene without the benefit of hindsight. There is no headline yet, no famous murder case, no photograph of Jill on television, no police press conference, no suspect, no courtroom. There is only an ordinary London day approaching its end. Jill is returning home. She has every reason to believe she will walk through her front door. Perhaps she is thinking about work. Perhaps about the people she will see later. Perhaps about the small, unremarkable things that fill a person's mind at the end of a day. The next morning, a meeting, a telephone call, a meal, a program, a weekend plan. The details of those final thoughts are unknowable, and that is one of the cruelest things about murder. A person's final ordinary moments can become extraordinary only after they are gone. A gesture that meant nothing at the time suddenly becomes a last gesture. A journey becomes a final journey. A doorway becomes a place where a life ended. And a person who was expected to come home simply does not. Jill reached her home in Fulham. She was close. So close that safety would have seemed almost guaranteed. Then someone approached her. The killer did not need to lure her into a car, did not need to break into a secluded building, did not need to take her somewhere far away. The attack happened at the threshold of her own home. A single shot was fired at close range, and then the killer disappeared. There is something particularly disturbing about a crime like this. The violence is concentrated into seconds, but the consequences spread across decades. For Jill, there was no second chance. For her family, there would be no normal ending to the day. For the investigators, there would be thousands of questions. For the public, there would be a face on television that suddenly meant something completely different. And for one man, Barry George, the murder would eventually become the center of his life. But at this point in the story, Barry George had not yet been convicted. He had not yet spent years in prison. His name had not yet become inseparable from Jill Dando's. The investigation was still young. The killer was still free. And the most frightening possibility was also the simplest. The person who had murdered Jill Dando had managed to walk away. Think about what that means. Somewhere beyond the immediate crime scene, London continued moving. Cars traveled along roads. People went about their evenings. Television programs were watched. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. People returned home. And among all of those ordinary lives, there was one person who knew what had happened. One person who knew where Jill had been standing. One person who knew how close the gun had been. One person who knew why the attack had happened, assuming there was a reason at all. That person was not standing inside the police cordon. He was not sitting beneath the harsh lights of an interrogation room. He was not being photographed by investigators. He was somewhere outside. Free. For the police, the first challenge was obvious. Find the killer. But the second challenge was far harder. Understand the victim. Understand her routine. Understand her relationships. Understand whether someone had been watching her. Understand whether the murder was personal, professional, random, planned, or something even more difficult to imagine. A woman who had become famous through television had been killed with extraordinary precision. There was no obvious struggle, no obvious robbery. The attack did not appear to be an impulsive street crime. It had the cold efficiency of someone who knew what they wanted to do. Yet efficiency alone does not reveal motive. A professional killer can have a motive. An obsessed individual can plan carefully. A stranger can commit a targeted attack. A personal enemy can leave almost nothing behind. The scene could tell investigators how Jill died. It could not immediately tell them why. And that question would haunt the investigation. The public naturally searched for an explanation. Some wondered whether Jill's work on Crime Watch had placed her in danger. She had spent years appearing on television while discussing serious crimes. She had helped put criminals' faces before the public. Could someone have wanted revenge? Could someone connected to one of those cases have targeted her? Could she have been stalked? Could the murder have been committed by someone obsessed with her personally? Could it have been an attack by someone who constructed an imagined relationship with a woman he knew only through television? Or was all of that wrong? Was Jill simply the target of a stranger whose reason would never be understood? Every possibility created another question. Every question created another theory. And every theory created another dead end. The investigation would eventually become enormous. But huge investigations do not always produce huge answers. Sometimes they produce fragments. A sighting here, a recollection there, a piece of forensic material, a strange object, a questionable statement, a person who appears suspicious, a person who seems to know too much, a person who seems to know nothing at all. Then, slowly, those fragments begin to form a picture. The danger is that a picture can look complete before it actually is. That would become one of the central lessons of the Jill Dando case, because eventually, investigators would find Barry George, and they would discover things about him that made him look suspicious. They would find material that appeared to suggest an unusual interest in women. They would examine his behavior. They would examine his movements. They would examine what he said. And then they would find something that seemed far more powerful than any strange photograph or unsettling detail. A microscopic particle, a particle of firearms discharge residue, something so small that, to the naked eye, it meant almost nothing. But inside a courtroom, that tiny particle would become enormous. It would help transform suspicion into conviction. It would help send Barry George to prison for life. And years later, the same piece of evidence would become one of the most important reasons that conviction collapsed. That is where this story becomes something more than a murder investigation. It becomes a story about certainty, about what happens when investigators believe they have found the answer, about how a tiny piece of physical evidence can appear to speak with absolute authority, and about what happens when experts later ask a devastating question. What if it did not mean what everyone thought it meant? For years, Barry George would remain associated with Jill Dando's murder. His name would appear beside hers. His photograph would become familiar. His conviction would seem to provide an ending. But there was a problem with that ending. Jill Dando was still dead. The killer had still not been conclusively identified in the way the public expected, and the weapon that fired the fatal shot did not simply lead investigators directly to a man standing at the end of a trail of evidence. Instead, the case rested heavily on interpretation, the difference between a fact and what someone believes that fact means. That distinction can be invisible when a case is moving forward. A jury hears evidence. A prosecutor builds a narrative. A defense lawyer challenges it. A judge gives instructions. A verdict is reached. And suddenly, a complicated chain of events becomes two words: guilty or not guilty. On July 2nd, 2001, Barry George was convicted of Jill Dando's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. For many people watching from the outside, that was the end. The killer had been found. The famous television presenter had finally received justice. The mystery had been solved, except it had not. Because the story was not finished, George maintained his innocence. His first appeal failed. He remained in prison. And the tiny particle of firearms discharge residue that had helped support the prosecution's case did not simply disappear. It stayed there, buried inside the legal history of the case, waiting for experts to look at it again. Years would pass. The world would change. Technology would change. Forensic thinking would change. And the confidence attached to that tiny piece of evidence would begin to fracture. In 2007, after a review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission and fresh expert evidence, George's conviction was referred back to the Court of Appeal. That court eventually quashed his conviction and ordered a retrial. The case had come full circle. The man once presented as Jill Dando's killer would again stand before a jury. But this time, the evidence would be viewed through a different lens. And on August 1st, 2008, Barry George was found not guilty. Not guilty. Two words that changed everything. They did not bring Jill Dando back. They did not identify another killer. They did not explain why she had been targeted. They did not answer every question left behind on a London street in April 1999. They simply meant that the state could no longer prove Barry George was a murderer beyond the required legal standard. And suddenly, the case had returned to its most disturbing state, unfinished. The man who had once been convicted was no longer legally responsible for the murder, but Jill Dando was still dead. The killer was still unknown. And somewhere inside the history of the case was a question that had survived every courtroom, every investigation, and every headline. Who was waiting for Jill Dando when she came home? Was it someone who had watched her from a distance? Someone who had become obsessed with her? Someone connected to her professional life? Someone who had chosen her for a reason investigators never discovered? Or was the explanation completely different? We know what happened to Jill. We know that she reached her home. We know that a gun was fired at close range. We know that the person responsible escaped. We know that Barry George was convicted, imprisoned, and later acquitted. We know that the forensic evidence that played a major role in his original conviction was subsequently called into question. But knowing those facts does not necessarily give us the truth, because sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not built around what we do not know. They are built around what we thought we knew. For years, the public was given an answer, then the answer was taken away, and what remained was a murder without a confirmed killer. A victim whose name was already known to millions before the day she died. A man whose life was transformed by an accusation and a conviction that would later collapse. And a tiny particle of forensic evidence that became a symbol of something much larger, the danger of mistaking possibility for certainty. So go back to that April afternoon. Forget the courtroom. Forget the newspapers. Forget the years of appeals. Forget Barry George. Forget the forensic arguments. Forget everything that came afterward. For one moment, there is only Jill, a 37-year-old woman coming home, a familiar street, a familiar door, a life that, from the outside, seemed to be continuing exactly as it should. She was almost home, and somewhere in those final moments, someone was close enough to kill her. The shot was fired. Jill fell. The killer left. And London carried on. But for the people who loved Jill, time stopped there. For investigators, the search had only begun. And for Britain, one of the most mysterious murder cases of the era had opened. The woman from the television screen was gone. The person who killed her had vanished. And the first question was not yet about Barry George. It was much simpler. Who killed Jill Dando? But before the name Barry George entered the investigation, before the forensic laboratories and courtroom battles, before a tiny particle of residue would acquire the power to alter a man's life, there was a much simpler mystery, the mystery of Jill herself. Because when someone is murdered, the first instinct is often to ask what the killer was like. Was he violent? Was he calculating? Was he obsessed? Was he angry? Was he waiting? But perhaps the more important question is this. What kind of person was worth waiting for? Jill Dando was not a politician. She was not a police officer. She was not a wealthy businesswoman whose fortune might have attracted a killer. She was a television presenter, a public face, a woman millions of people had seen, but relatively few had truly known. That distinction would become important. To the public, Jill existed almost everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She appeared on television, smiling into cameras, speaking about crimes that had already happened to other people. She could look directly into a lens and ask someone watching at home to remember a face, to remember a car, to remember a voice, to remember a tiny detail that might help police find a missing person or identify a criminal. Her work depended on attention. Yet, when Jill became the victim, the question became whether someone had been paying too much attention to her. That possibility would eventually become one of the darkest threads running through the investigation. Because fame creates a strange kind of intimacy. A viewer can see a television personality several times a week and begin to feel that they know them. They know the sound of their voice. They recognize their expressions. They know the way they smile. They know the clothes they wear on screen. They know the places where they appear. But the relationship exists almost entirely on one side. The viewer knows the presenter. The presenter does not know the viewer. For most people, that invisible boundary remains exactly where it should be. But occasionally, someone crosses it. A person can take familiarity and turn it into possession. A television image can become a fantasy. A passing glance can become an imagined connection. A stranger can begin constructing an entire relationship with someone who has never met them. Investigators would eventually have to ask whether something like that had happened to Jill. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the murder had nothing to do with fame. Perhaps the television connection was irrelevant. Perhaps the explanation was hidden somewhere far more ordinary. A relationship, a professional contact, a personal grievance, a chance encounter, or a person Jill had never even noticed. That uncertainty made the first stages of the investigation especially difficult. There was no obvious motive waiting to be uncovered. No angry letter. No public threat that could be immediately connected to the murder. No simple explanation that could be placed before the public and accepted as the answer. Instead, investigators were faced with an enormous blank space. And blank spaces invite speculation. Almost immediately, theories began to multiply. One theory suggested that Jill might have been targeted because of her association with Crime Watch. It was a seductive theory. Crime Watch dealt directly with criminals. Its audience was enormous. Its broadcast could help identify suspects. People featured on the program could find themselves exposed to millions of viewers. Could someone connected to a criminal investigation have decided that Jill herself should pay the price? It was possible. But possibility is not proof, and investigators had to distinguish between the two. That distinction would become increasingly important as the case developed, because the more famous the victim became, the more theories surrounded her death. The public wanted a reason. The media wanted a story. The police needed evidence. Those three things are not always the same. A theory can make sense without being true. A suspect can look suspicious without being guilty. And evidence can appear powerful until someone asks a different question about what it actually proves. That last point would eventually define Barry George's story. But on the day Jill died, nobody knew any of that. At that moment, investigators were simply trying to reconstruct a sequence of seconds. Where had Jill been? Who had seen her? Who had been nearby? Who had traveled through the area? Had anyone noticed a man waiting? Had anyone heard the shot? Had anyone seen someone leave? Had anyone remembered a vehicle? Had anyone noticed something unusual before they understood that it was unusual? These questions are painfully difficult because witnesses do not experience the world like cameras. A person can walk down a street and see hundreds of faces without remembering a single one. A car can pass within meters and leave no impression. A stranger can stand nearby for several minutes and become invisible to the people around him. Then a crime occurs. Suddenly, everyone is asked to remember. What did you see? What did he look like? How tall was he? What was he wearing? Which direction did he go? How long was he there? Did you hear anything? Did you notice anyone following her? Memory becomes evidence. And memory, unlike a fingerprint or a piece of physical material, can change. It can sharpen. It can blur. It can absorb information from other people's recollections. It can be influenced by what a witness later hears on television. It can become more confident without becoming more accurate. In a case as famous as Jill Dando's, that danger was enormous. Every new detail was immediately surrounded by public attention. Every possible sighting mattered. Every rumor could become another headline. And every headline could influence what people believed they remembered. Yet somewhere beneath the noise, there were physical facts. Jill had been shot. The attack had happened at close range. The killer had escaped. And somewhere there had to be a path between the gun and the person who fired it. Investigators would search for that path. They would examine the scene. They would examine Jill's clothing. They would examine possible traces left behind. They would reconstruct movements. They would look for the weapon. They would ask whether the person responsible had left anything behind. And they would eventually focus on something so small that it could sit almost unnoticed on a piece of fabric. Firearms discharge residue, a microscopic trace created by the discharge of a firearm. In the world of forensic investigation, particles like these can seem almost magical. They are invisible clues, tiny remnants of an event that has already disappeared. A gun fires. The explosion produces heat and pressure. Material is expelled. Some of it settles on nearby surfaces. Some can remain on clothing or skin. And if investigators find it in the right place, it can appear to connect a person to a weapon. But there's a question that must always come before the conclusion. How did it get there? That question sounds simple. It is not. A particle does not come with a label explaining its history. It cannot tell an investigator where it has been. It cannot say whether it came from the fatal shot, another firearm, environmental contamination, or some other source. The particle exists. The meaning has to be constructed. And in 1999, the investigators examining Jill Dando's murder were working in a world where forensic science carried enormous authority in the public imagination. Television had taught audiences to expect laboratories to solve mysteries. A scientist examines a microscopic trace. A computer processes the information. A match appears. The suspect is identified. The case is solved. Real forensic science is rarely so clean. Evidence has limitations. Experts disagree. Methods improve. Assumptions are challenged. And sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can produce the largest mistake. Barry George would eventually discover how devastating that could be. But he was not yet the center of the story. The center was still Jill. And there is something important that can be lost when a murder becomes famous. The victim can become a photograph, a headline, a name repeated so often that the person behind it begins to disappear. Jill was more than the woman whose murder became a mystery. She had a family, friends, colleagues, people who knew the person away from the cameras, people who knew her laugh when she was not presenting, people who knew what she was like when the studio lights were gone, people who knew her as Jill rather than as Jill Dando, television presenter. For those people, there was no mystery in the beginning. There was only loss. The world might ask who killed her. Her loved ones first had to face the fact that she was never coming home. That difference matters. True crime can easily become obsessed with the puzzle. The victim becomes a doorway into the investigation. But behind every investigation is a human being whose life has been interrupted. In Jill's case, that life had been visible to the public for years. Her death, therefore, produced a peculiar kind of national shock. People felt as though someone familiar had suddenly disappeared. Viewers who had never met her knew her face. People who had watched her on Crime Watch knew her voice. And suddenly the woman who had asked the public to help solve other people's crimes had become the subject of one of Britain's biggest murder investigations. The irony was impossible to ignore. But irony does not solve a murder. Evidence does. And investigators needed evidence. They needed something that could survive scrutiny. Something that could take them from suspicion to certainty. Something that could identify the person who had stood close enough to Jill to fire a weapon into her head. At first, that evidence did not seem to exist. There was no clear eyewitness who could simply point to a face and say, "That is the man." There was no confession. There was no incontrovertible DNA link that placed a killer at the scene. There was no neat trail leading directly from the body to a waiting suspect. The killer had left behind something much more frustrating. Questions. And questions are dangerous because they can make almost anyone look guilty if you stare at them long enough. Who knew Jill? Who watched Jill? Who lived nearby? Who had been seen in the area? Who had a history that made investigators uncomfortable? Who had behaved strangely? Who had lied? Who had changed their story? Who had an interest in guns? Who had an interest in Jill? Who could have done it? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, who looked like the kind of person who could have done it? That is where an investigation can begin to shift, not from evidence to suspect, but from suspect to evidence. Once investigators focus on a particular person, every detail surrounding that person can begin to acquire meaning. An object that might once have been considered meaningless can suddenly appear suspicious. A strange statement becomes potentially significant. A coincidence becomes a clue. An unusual habit becomes evidence of character. A person who already seems unsettling can make every ambiguous detail look darker. This is not unique to the Jill Dando case. It is one of the oldest dangers in criminal investigation. Humans are natural storytellers. We see disconnected events and instinctively try to connect them. We want the pieces to fit. We want the story to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Most of all, we want the ending to explain the horror. Barry George would eventually become the person placed inside that story. Investigators would examine his life. They would look at his behavior. They would look at material found among his possessions. They would consider accounts suggesting an unusual interest in women and in Jill Dando. And gradually, suspicion would begin to gather around him. But suspicion has weight only when it is supported by evidence. And investigators still needed something stronger, something physical, something that could stand before a jury, something that could turn a theory into a prosecution. That something be found in the form of the tiny firearms discharge residue particle. It was almost absurdly small compared with the scale of what it would eventually cause. A particle could not speak. It could not identify Barry George. It could not tell a jury what had happened outside Jill's home. Yet it would become one of the most important pieces in the prosecution's case. The meaning attached to it would be enormous. And once that meaning was accepted, the case would change. A suspect will become a defendant. A defendant will become a convicted murderer. And a murder that had begun with one unanswered question would appear, for a time, to have finally found its answer. But history would eventually ask another question. Was the answer ever reliable? That question would not be answered quickly. Years would pass before the evidence was properly challenged. By then, Barry George would already have lost years of his life. And Jill Dando's family would still be living with the absence created on that London afternoon. This is why the story cannot simply be told as a mystery about who killed Jill Dando. It is also a story about what happens when a society desperately wants a murder to have an ending. The public wants a name. The police need a suspect. The prosecution needs a case. The jury needs to decide. The court needs to deliver a verdict. But none of those things can change the past. They cannot restore Jill. They cannot recreate the seconds before the gunshot. They cannot tell her what happened after she turned toward her front door. They cannot ask the killer why. And they cannot guarantee that the first person placed at the center of the investigation is the person who actually committed the crime. For Jill, there will be no second chance. For Barry George, there would be an entire second chapter. And that chapter would begin with a conviction. It would pass through prison walls. It would move into appeals. It would return to forensic laboratories. It would reach the Court of Appeal. And eventually, it would arrive back at the same courtroom where the story had once seemed to end. But that was years away. On April 26, 1999, none of that existed yet. There was only the murder. A woman, a doorway, a gun, a killer who disappeared, and a city that had no idea it was witnessing the beginning of one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern British history. The question that would follow Jill's death for years was deceptively simple. Who pulled the trigger? But beneath it were dozens of others. Why Jill? Why outside her home? Why that day? Why that method? Why leave so little behind? And if Barry George was not ultimately responsible, then who was? Those questions remain the shadows surrounding Jill Dando's story. Because the most unsettling thing about an unsolved murder is not simply that someone got away. It is that the world has to continue without knowing who they were. The streets remain. The houses remain. The memories remain. The victim's face remains in photographs. And somewhere in that ordinary landscape, the answer may have existed all along. Perhaps it was seen by someone who did not realize what they had witnessed. Perhaps it was hidden inside a detail, dismissed as irrelevant. Perhaps it was buried beneath years of assumptions. Or perhaps the person responsible took the truth with them and never revealed it. Jill Dando went home that day expecting an ordinary ending to an ordinary journey. She never reached the life waiting on the other side of her front door. And the person who stopped her would become the invisible figure at the center of everything that followed. The investigation would search for him. The police would build theories around him. The courtroom would eventually name a man. Then, years later, that name would be removed. And when the legal dust finally settled, one terrible fact remained untouched. Jill Dando had been murdered. Barry George was no longer legally responsible for that murder, and the identity of the person who killed her remained unresolved. The story, therefore, does not end with a verdict. It begins with a question that has survived every accusation, every conviction, every appeal, and every acquittal. Who was the person standing near Jill Dando in the final seconds of her life? And why did he decide that she should never make it through that door? There is a particular kind of silence that exists after a life has been taken. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is a silence created when a future suddenly disappears. A person can leave a house in the morning and, without knowing it, leave behind 1,000 things that belong to the future. A cup that will never be used again. A message that will never receive a reply. A plan that will never happen. A door that will be opened by everyone except the person who was supposed to come home. For Jill Dando, that future ended outside her own home. And yet, from the perspective of the world around her, almost nothing had changed. London remained London. People continued traveling through its streets. Television schedules continued. The BBC continued broadcasting. Millions of people who knew Jill only as a familiar face on their screens continued with their day, without knowing that she had just become the center of a murder investigation. That is one of the strangest things about death. The world does not stop when one person's world stops. It keeps moving. And sometimes the people left behind have to watch it move without the person they expected to see beside them. Jill's death would eventually become a national story. But before it became a story, it was a personal catastrophe. Before journalists arrived, before television cameras gathered outside police cordons, before investigators began assembling timelines, there were people who simply had to understand that Jill was gone, that she was not coming back, that the final moments of her life had been violent, that someone had deliberately taken it, and that person was still somewhere beyond the reach of the police. The thought is difficult to escape. A murderer does not disappear into another dimension. They continue existing. They eat. They sleep. They walk through streets. They enter shops. They speak to people. They watch television. They hear the news. And when the victim's photograph appears on the screen, the person responsible can watch alongside everyone else. Perhaps they feel nothing. Perhaps they feel fear. Perhaps they feel satisfaction. Perhaps they convince themselves that what they did was justified. Or perhaps they simply remain silent. Investigators could not know. They had to search the person without knowing what was happening inside that person's mind. That search would eventually become one of the largest and most closely watched investigations Britain had seen. But the public did not experience the investigation as a collection of evidence. The public experienced it as a mystery. And mysteries create expectations. People wanted a suspect. They wanted a motive. They wanted a face. They wanted the moment when the police would finally walk into a room, place handcuffs around someone's wrists, and announce that the mystery was over. But real investigations do not move according to the rhythm of television. There is no guarantee that the first theory will be correct. There is no guarantee that the most suspicious person is the killer. There is no guarantee that physical evidence will be as clear as it appears. And there is no guarantee that a courtroom verdict will be the final word. The Jill Dando investigation would eventually demonstrate all of those truths. At first, however, the investigation had something more immediate to deal with: the question of whether Jill had been deliberately targeted. It was difficult to imagine that such a violent attack could be completely random. She had not been killed during a robbery. The attack was not the chaotic result of a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Someone had approached her. Someone had a firearm. Someone fired at close range. Then that person left. That sequence suggested intention. But intention is not the same as motive. A person can deliberately kill without leaving investigators an obvious reason. The killer may know something the police do not. The killer may believe something that is completely unknown to everyone else. The killer may have constructed a fantasy around the victim, or the victim may have been selected for a reason that has never been discovered. That uncertainty would hang over Jill's case. And because Jill was a public figure, investigators had to consider a particularly disturbing possibility. Someone may have known where she lived. Someone may have known what she looked like. Someone may have known her routines. Someone may have watched her without ever being noticed. Fame makes this possible. The more recognizable a person becomes, the less control they have over who recognizes them. For Jill, millions knew her face, but she could not possibly know millions of theirs. That imbalance can create a strange vulnerability. A stranger can know the details of a public person's life without ever being part of that person's world. They may know where the person works. They may know when they appear on television. They may know the names of colleagues. They may know what the person looks like when they leave work. And if obsession enters the equation, ordinary information can become something far more dangerous. Investigators would eventually have to examine whether Jill had been watched. But at the beginning, there was no clear answer. There was only the possibility. And possibilities are dangerous when an investigation is still young. Because once an idea enters the public imagination, it can become difficult to remove. The idea of a stalker was compelling. The idea of a criminal connected to Crime Watch was compelling. The idea of an international conspiracy was compelling. The idea of a random stranger was compelling. Every theory had one thing in common. It could explain the murder. But being able to explain something is not the same as being able to prove it. That distinction will become the dividing line between the investigation and the story people wanted to hear. The police needed facts. The public wanted answers. The media wanted developments. And Jill's family wanted something much simpler. They wanted the person responsible to be found. The first days after a high-profile murder can feel endless. Investigators work through information that arrives faster than it can be processed. Names are checked. Statements are taken. Telephone records may be examined. Movements are reconstructed. People are asked to remember events they might otherwise have forgotten. Every possible connection to the victim is considered. The police do not have the luxury of knowing which details matter. They must collect first and understand later. That means an investigation can become enormous. Thousands of pieces of information may accumulate around a single event. Most will be irrelevant. Some will be misleading. A few may be crucial. The challenge is knowing which is which. The danger becomes even greater when a suspect emerges, because a suspect changes the way information is interpreted. Before a suspect exists, investigators ask, "What happened?" After a suspect emerges, the question can subtly become, "How does what happened fit this person?" That shift can be almost invisible, but it matters. If a man is known to have behaved strangely, investigators may ask whether the behavior is connected to crime. If he owns something unusual, they may ask whether it could have a connection. If he was somewhere near the area, that may suddenly become important. If his explanation contains inconsistencies, those inconsistencies may appear more significant. Individually, each detail may be ambiguous. Together, they can create the impression of a pattern. And once people see a pattern, they naturally want to believe the pattern is real. This is where Barry George would eventually enter the story. But before his name became associated with Jill's murder, there was another process taking place: the construction of Jill's final timeline. Every minute mattered. Where had she been? How had she traveled? When had she arrived? Who could have known she was coming? Was anyone waiting? The investigators had to reconstruct a world that had existed for only a few seconds. The attack itself was brief. The investigation would last for years. That contrast is difficult to comprehend. A single action can take less than a second. The consequences can last a lifetime. The gunshot was instantaneous. The questions were not. Why was Jill targeted? Who had been watching? How did the killer know where she would be? How did the killer approach without attracting attention? Where did the killer go immediately afterward? Did the killer have a car? Did the killer walk? Was another person involved? Was the weapon obtained specifically for the murder? Was the attack planned days earlier? Or had the killer simply been waiting for an opportunity? Every answer created another question, and every unanswered question made the case more unsettling. There was another fact that made the murder particularly chilling. The attack happened at Jill's home. Home is supposed to be the place where the public world ends. For a television presenter, the front door represents a boundary. Outside is the audience, the cameras, the strangers, the work, the public life. Inside is private life, family, friends, routine, safety. But Jill's killer crossed that boundary without needing to enter the house. The attack happened at the threshold, the place where public life was supposed to become private. That detail will remain psychologically powerful long after the crime scene had disappeared, because it suggested that even the place Jill considered her own was not beyond the killer's reach. And if the killer had deliberately chosen that location, another possibility emerged. Perhaps the killer was not simply looking for Jill. Perhaps the killer was waiting for her. That difference changes everything. A person looking for someone must find them. A person waiting already knows where they will appear. If the killer had been waiting, then the murder may have depended on knowledge of Jill's movements. But again, that was a question, not a proven fact. Investigators had to resist the temptation to fill the gaps with assumptions. The truth might have been much simpler, or much stranger. And then there was the weapon. A firearm introduces its own trail. Where did it come from? Who had possessed it? Who had handled it? Where was it afterward? A murder weapon can be both the most important object in a case and the most elusive. If recovered, it can potentially connect a crime to a suspect. If never recovered, it leaves investigators searching through possibilities. The weapon used to kill Jill will become a crucial part of the mystery. But another kind of evidence would prove even more important. Evidence so small that it could barely be seen. A particle, a trace, a microscopic remnant of a gun being fired. Firearms discharge residue. The idea was straightforward. If a person fires a gun, microscopic particles can be deposited on their hands, clothing, or nearby surfaces. Finding such residue can therefore be significant, but significant does not mean conclusive. The real question is always context. Where was it found? How much was found? What were its characteristics? Could it have arrived there another way? Could it have been transferred? Could it have come from an unrelated firearm? Could it have been introduced after the event? The answers matter because forensic evidence is not a witness. It cannot tell a complete story. It provides fragments. Experts interpret those fragments. Courts decide what weight to give them. And in Barry George's case, one microscopic fragment would eventually become the center of a legal battle that lasted years. At the time, however, nobody knew that. Nobody knew that the particle would help secure a murder conviction. Nobody knew that the conviction would later be overturned. Nobody knew that George would eventually be acquitted. Nobody knew that the murder itself would remain unresolved. The investigation was still moving forward. And somewhere within the mass of information surrounding Jill's death, Barry George was beginning to emerge. His name would not simply appear because he happened to live in the same part of London. There would be a collection of circumstances, his background, his behavior, material associated with him, questions about his interest in women, questions about his possible interest in Jill, questions about where he had been, and eventually the forensic residue. Piece by piece, the prosecution would construct a narrative. The narrative would be powerful enough to persuade a jury. But a narrative can be persuasive even when individual pieces within it are weaker than they first appear. That is one of the most uncomfortable lessons of criminal justice. A jury does not experience a case as a collection of isolated facts. They hear a story. The prosecution tells them what the evidence means. The defense tells them why it may mean something else. The jury must decide which interpretation survives. In 2001, that decision would go against Barry George. But before that happened, there were years of investigation, years during which the police had to answer a question that remained brutally simple. Who killed Jill Dando? The answer would appear to be Barry George. Then it would appear not to be. And after that, the question would return to where it had begun. Who did? That is why the story of Jill Dando cannot be reduced to the rise and fall of one suspect. Barry George is central to the legal history of the case. But Jill remains at its center emotionally. Her death is what began everything. Her absence is what remains. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember as the investigation unfolds. The case is not really about a particle. It is not about a courtroom. It is not about headlines. It is not even ultimately about Barry George. It is about a woman who walked toward her home and never reached a life waiting inside. Everything else came afterward. The theories, the suspicion, the arrests, the forensic evidence, the conviction, the prison sentence, the appeal, the new experts, the retrial, the acquittal, and the unanswered question. But on that April day, none of those words existed. There was only Jill, and there was someone else. Someone who came close enough to fire a weapon. Someone who knew that after pulling the trigger, they had only one task left: leave. And they did. That is a part of the story that remains almost unbearably simple. The killer did not need to explain anything, did not need to defend a motive, did not need to answer questions, did not need to sit before a jury. The killer simply disappeared into the world. The investigation would spend years trying to bring that person back into view. And perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the killer may have been watching the investigation from the beginning, watching Jill's photograph appear in newspapers, watching police officers search the streets, watching detectives appeal for information, watching suspects emerge, watching Barry George's name become public, watching a man go to prison, watching him appeal, watching the evidence surrounding him collapse, and finally watching him walk free. If that person was watching, they would have witnessed something extraordinary. They would have watched the justice system come within inches of providing an answer. Then they would have watched that answer disappear. But there is no way to know whether that happened. It is only one of the many possibilities left behind by an unsolved murder. And that is where the real darkness of the Jill Dando case lies. Not in some supernatural mystery. Not in an elaborate conspiracy that can be proven by connecting unrelated details. The darkness is much more ordinary. A person made a decision. A woman died. And the truth may have been lost somewhere between those two moments. The years that follow would attempt to recover it. The investigation would produce a suspect. The suspect would become a convicted murderer. The conviction would collapse. And when everything else had been stripped away, the original question would still be waiting. Who killed Jill Dando? To answer it, investigators would have to go back. Back through Jill's final movements. Back through the people who knew her. Back through the strangers who may have watched her. Back through the evidence recovered after the shooting. Back through the assumptions that shaped the investigation. And eventually, back to the tiny particle that once seemed capable of solving everything. Because sometimes the key to understanding a murder is not discovering new evidence. Sometimes it is discovering that the evidence you trusted did not mean what you thought it meant. And that is where the next chapter of this story begins. Not with a confession. Not with a dramatic arrest. But with a microscopic trace that would help turn suspicion into certainty, certainty into a conviction, and a conviction into one of Britain's most controversial miscarriages of justice. The name attached to that conviction was Barry George, but the woman whose name could never be separated from the case was Jill Dando. And the question that began on a quiet London street in April 1999 was still waiting for an answer. Who was the last person Jill saw? And what did that person want from her? To understand the murder of Jill Dando, you have to understand the place where her life ended. Not a dark alley. Not an abandoned warehouse. Not a deserted stretch of countryside. Fulham. West London. A neighborhood where houses stood close together and ordinary life unfolded behind ordinary doors. People went to work in the morning. Children went to school. Cars moved along residential streets. Neighbors recognized one another. Deliveries arrived. Windows were cleaned. Gardens were tended. Dogs were walked. The city existed in the background, but the streets themselves could feel almost removed from the chaos of central London. And somewhere within that ordinary landscape stood 29 Gowan Avenue. This was Jill Dando's home, a place that, for a television personality, represented something important. Privacy. Away from the BBC studios, away from cameras and producers, away from the constant recognition that came with being one of Britain's most familiar television presenters. This was where Jill could simply be Jill. But on the morning of April 26, 1999, that boundary between public life and private life was about to disappear. The day began without any obvious warning that something terrible was coming. There was no visible sign of violence waiting around the corner. No emergency. No public confrontation. No dramatic event announcing itself. Instead, there was a woman making plans for an ordinary day. Jill had been staying with her fiancé, Dr. Alan Farthing, at his home in Chiswick. The two were engaged. They were planning to marry later that year. There was a future being prepared. A wedding. A life together. The kind of plans that make the present feel temporary, because the mind is already moving toward what comes next. On that Monday morning, Jill left the Chiswick house in her BMW convertible. She was not traveling toward a dangerous meeting. She was not responding to a threat. She was simply going to Hammersmith. She had shopping to do. One of the places she visited was King's Mall. There, she went into Ryman's and bought stationery. It was the kind of detail that would have meant absolutely nothing on an ordinary day. A shopping trip. A few purchases. A drive through West London. But after a murder, ordinary details become precious. Investigators begin treating them like pieces of a clock. If they can place Jill in one location at a certain time and another location later, they can begin measuring the space between those moments. The route becomes important. The time becomes important. The people who might have seen her become important. A journey that lasted less than an hour can become the foundation of a criminal investigation. And Jill's journey that morning would eventually be reconstructed minute by minute. At around 10 o'clock, she left Chiswick. She went to Hammersmith. Then she traveled toward Fulham, toward the house she owned on Gowan Avenue. She had been preparing that property for sale as she and Alan prepared for their marriage. That detail is easy to overlook, but psychologically, it changes the way the house feels. It was not simply a place where Jill lived. It was a place she was preparing to leave behind. Her future was beginning to move somewhere else. The house was becoming part of a past she expected to close. And yet, on April 26, it became the final setting of her life. There is something deeply unsettling about that transformation. A home is filled with objects that are designed for continuity. Keys, furniture, photographs, clothes, letters, kitchen utensils, books, things bought with the assumption that tomorrow will come. People do not normally enter their homes thinking about the possibility that they will die at the front door. The human mind is not built that way. Safety is often assumed rather than examined. A familiar street becomes invisible through repetition. A familiar doorway becomes part of the background. A person reaches for their keys without thinking. That automatic familiarity may have been what made the attack possible. The killer did not have to persuade Jill to follow him somewhere, did not have to lure her into a vehicle, did not have to force open a door. If investigators were right that someone had been waiting for her, then the killer only had to wait. Wait for the right car. Wait for the right woman. Wait for the moment when she was close enough, and then act. That possibility would become one of the most chilling elements of the investigation. Because in the days following the murder, witnesses told police that a man had been seen near Jill's home before she arrived. A window cleaner reportedly noticed a man outside the house around an hour before the shooting. He was described as a white man, with neatly cut dark or brown hair, dressed in dark clothing, and carrying what appeared to be a mobile phone. The man was reportedly walking around the area, waiting, or at least appearing to wait. But even that description had to be treated carefully. A man standing on a residential street is not necessarily a murderer. A man with a mobile phone is not necessarily watching a house. A man walking back and forth may simply be walking. At the time, however, investigators were trying to understand a crime in which the victim had been shot moments after arriving home. The possibility that the killer had been waiting was therefore impossible to ignore. Then came other sightings. Witnesses described a man who appeared similar to the first description. Another person reported seeing a man in the area shortly before the attack. After the shooting, people described someone moving away from Gowan Avenue. One witness later described a well-dressed man leaving the area with an unusual calmness. Another reported seeing a man moving quickly. Further accounts placed a man near Bishop's Park. Then there was a bus. A man matching the general description of the suspect was later reported to have boarded a number 74 bus on Fulham Palace Road. The journey took him toward Putney Bridge. He was reportedly sweating heavily. He was seen getting off near Putney Bridge Station. And then, once again, the trail seemed to disappear. That sequence would become one of the central mysteries of the early investigation. Because if the witnesses were describing the same man, then the police had something they desperately needed. A route. A direction. A person moving away from the crime scene. The killer had not simply vanished. Someone had seen him. Perhaps several people had seen him. The problem was that nobody had seen enough. Descriptions were imperfect. Faces were not photographs. People remembered clothing differently. Details changed. And the man described by witnesses was not immediately identified. The investigation therefore entered a strange phase. The police knew there had probably been a man near the scene, but knowing that a man existed was very different from knowing who he was. And there was another problem. The murder had taken place in daylight. on a residential street. Yet the fatal shot itself had not produced the kind of obvious public reaction investigators might have expected. There were questions about whether the gun had been fitted with a suppressor. There was speculation about how the weapon had been used. But at the beginning, the important fact was simpler. Jill had been attacked at extremely close range. The gunman had been close enough to fire directly into the side of her head. There was little room for hesitation, little room for error, and almost no time for Jill to understand what was happening. She had barely reached her doorway, according to the reconstruction investigators developed. She had not even had a meaningful opportunity to get safely inside. Her home was right there. The door was right there. The distance between life and death was measured in steps. That physical geography would become central to the investigation. Police would examine the front door, the gate, the pavement, the surrounding houses, the approaches to Gowan Avenue, possible escape routes, possible places where someone could wait without attracting attention. Every angle mattered. Every sightline mattered. Every witness mattered. Because if the killer had been standing outside the house for an extended period, then someone might have seen him. Perhaps a neighbor. Perhaps a passing driver. Perhaps someone walking to work. Perhaps someone who remembered nothing unusual until they heard the news. That is one of the frustrations of investigations involving public spaces. The most important witness may not realize they are a witness. A person can see something in the morning and forget it by lunch. Then, hours later, a television report reveals that the thing they saw was connected to a murder. Suddenly, memory becomes important. But memory is not a recording. It changes when people try to reconstruct it. The image of a stranger can become clearer in someone's mind after seeing an artist's impression. A description heard on television can influence what a person thinks they remember. And in a case receiving national attention, that danger becomes even greater. Jill Dando's murder was news almost immediately. She was too well known for it not to be. Her face appeared on television. Her name was spoken across Britain. The same woman who had presented programs to millions was now the subject of emergency news reports. For viewers, the transformation was shocking. For the police, it created an enormous investigative challenge. Every new detail could generate calls. Every rumor could generate another lead. Every supposed sighting could consume hours of police work. But investigators had no choice. They had to follow possibilities. Because somewhere among the false leads might be the one detail that mattered. The location itself offered another strange feature. Gowan Avenue was not isolated. It was a lived-in residential street. The kind of place where people might know who belonged there. A stranger could stand out. Yet a stranger could also disappear into the background. A man in a dark suit, carrying a mobile phone, would not necessarily look suspicious in London. A man standing beside a car might be waiting for someone. A man walking along the pavement might be going to work. A man crossing the street might be completely unconnected to the murder. The killer, if he was a stranger, did not need to look frightening. In fact, looking ordinary may have been an advantage. This is one of the most unsettling realities of crime. Danger rarely announces itself with a face that says danger. The person standing a few meters away may look completely harmless. The person walking behind you may simply be another pedestrian. The person who watches you may appear to be looking at something else. And when the moment comes, the transformation from ordinary stranger to murderer can happen in seconds. For Jill, those seconds would be irreversible. For the witnesses, they would become memories. For the police, they would become evidence. And for the public, they would become the beginning of a mystery. The investigators soon developed a working picture of Jill's final morning. She had left Chiswick. She had gone shopping in Hammersmith. She had traveled to her home in Fulham. Someone may have been watching the house. A man was reportedly seen near the property. Then Jill arrived. The shooting happened. The suspect fled. A man matching the description was seen moving through the area. He reached Fulham Palace Road. He boarded a bus. He traveled toward Putney Bridge. And then the trail faded. It was an extraordinary sequence. The police appear to have a suspect description. They had witnesses. They had possible escape routes. They had CCTV footage from parts of the surrounding area. They had Jill's movements. They had the crime scene. And yet, they did not have the one thing they needed most: a name. The investigation began expanding outward. Police looked at people in Jill's personal life. They considered former relationships. They examined the possibility of a stalker. They looked at her professional world. They considered whether her work on Crime Watch had created enemies. They examined whether someone connected to a case she had covered could have wanted revenge. They considered the possibility of a contract killing. They even examined theories involving the conflict in Kosovo and Serbia, particularly because Jill had been involved in a public appeal connected with Kosovan refugees. But no theory immediately produced the evidence needed to establish a motive. This is where the setting of the case becomes more important than it first appears. Jill's public identity made almost every theory possible. She was famous. She worked on a program about crime. She had been visible to millions. She had relationships. She had a private home. She had fans. She had strangers who knew her face. She had people who may have written to her. She had appeared in newspapers and magazines. Her life existed in both public and private spaces. That meant investigators were forced to search through an enormous number of possible connections. A normal person's murder can already be complicated. The murder of someone whose life is partially public can become exponentially more complicated. And Jill's association with Crime Watch added another layer. The program had been built around the idea that ordinary people could help identify criminals. Now the woman presenting it had become the victim. The irony was almost unbearable. Jill had spent years asking the public to look. Now the police were asking the public to look for whoever had killed her. The same medium that had helped bring criminals into the public eye was now being used to search for the person responsible for Jill's death. But there was one thing the police could not broadcast. They could not broadcast certainty. At this stage, there was no certainty. There were only clues: a possible suspect, a possible route, a possible motive, a possible connection, a possible witness, and then another possibility: the possibility that the killer had known exactly when Jill would arrive. If that were true, the murder might have required surveillance. Someone might have been watching the house. Someone might have learned Jill's routine. Someone might have known that she would return that morning. But again, investigators had to separate what seemed logical from what could be proven. The man seen outside the house might have been the killer, or he might have been completely unrelated. The blue Range Rover reported in the area might have been connected, or it might have been a coincidence. The man seen traveling on the bus might have been fleeing the scene, or he might have been another stranger who happened to resemble the description. The photographs of Jill that later became part of the investigation might have suggested surveillance, or they might have had a far more innocent origin. Each clue seemed to open a door, and behind every door was another hallway. The investigation was becoming larger, not smaller. That is what makes the early stages of a murder case so psychologically exhausting. Every answer can create 3 more questions. If someone was watching Jill, who was it? If they knew where she lived, how did they know? If they knew when she would arrive, how did they know? If the killer was waiting, how long had they waited? If they escaped by bus, where did they go afterward? If they changed their appearance, why? If they had a mobile phone, who were they speaking to? If the murder was planned, where was the weapon obtained? And if it was not planned, how did the killer happen to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time? There was no shortage of theories. What the investigation lacked was a theory that could be proven. And while detectives worked through those questions, Jill's life was being reconstructed by the people who had known her. Her colleagues remembered the woman viewers saw on television. Her friends remembered the woman behind the television image. Her family remembered Jill before fame. Her fiancé had been preparing to marry her. She had been making plans for a future that, only hours earlier, had seemed completely real. Now those plans existed only in the memories of other people. That is the quiet tragedy behind the geography of the case. To investigators, Gowan Avenue was a crime scene. To Jill, it had been home. To her family, it became the place where their memories divided into 2 periods. before April 26, 1999, and after, the house remained. The street remained. The door remained. But Jill was gone. And somewhere beyond the police cordon, the person who had taken her life was gone too. The investigators would eventually turn their attention toward Barry George. They would discover information that seemed to connect him to the world of the victim. They would examine his possessions, his behavior, his movements, his history. They would hear witnesses who claimed to have seen him near Jill's home. And eventually, they would find the microscopic particle that would become the prosecution's most powerful physical evidence. But none of that was visible yet. On the morning of April 26, the case was still an open landscape. A woman had left one home. She had traveled through West London. She had gone shopping. She had driven to another home. And at the end of that journey, someone was waiting. Whether that person had planned the murder for days, weeks, or longer would become one of the central questions. But there was one detail that investigators could not escape. The killer had chosen a moment when Jill was vulnerable, not because she was physically weak, not because she was alone in some remote place, but because she had reached a point where people instinctively lower their guard. The final few steps home, the moment when a person stops looking outward and starts thinking about getting inside. The keys, the door, the familiar threshold. Jill was almost there, and whoever killed her knew that the distance between the street and the safety of her home was only a few feet. Those few feet became the most important piece of geography in the entire case, because somewhere within them, a famous television presenter encountered a stranger, and within seconds, the ordinary Monday morning that had begun with shopping and plans for a wedding became a murder scene. The city around Gowan Avenue continued to exist, but for Jill, the world ended there. For the police, the search began there, and for Britain, the question began there. Not yet, who is Barry George? Not yet, what did the forensic evidence mean? Not yet, would someone eventually be convicted? The first question was much closer to the ground. Who had been standing outside Jill Dando's home? And had that person been waiting for her all along? There was another world surrounding Gowan Avenue, a world that had nothing to do with murder. That was the world Jill belonged to before she became a victim. It was made up of small routines, morning journeys, television schedules, telephone calls, appointments, shopping, friends, family, work. The things people rarely remember because they seem too ordinary to deserve remembering. That is what makes the final day of someone's life so difficult to reconstruct. The person living it does not know which moments will matter. Jill could not have known that the drive through West London would later be examined by detectives. She could not have known that the places she visited would become points on a map. She could not have known that someone would eventually try to calculate the minutes between those places. To her, it was simply a Monday. The world had not yet changed. She was still planning her wedding. She was still working. She was still moving between the different parts of her life. There was Jill the television presenter, Jill the daughter, Jill the friend, Jill the colleague, Jill the woman preparing to marry. And there was Jill alone, sitting behind the wheel of her car, moving through London. That last version of Jill is perhaps the hardest to imagine. Not the woman on television, not the photograph used in newspapers after her death, but the private Jill, the woman who did not know she was living through her final morning. Fame can create a strange distance between a person and the people who watch them. For millions of viewers, Jill was familiar, but familiarity is not intimacy. They knew her because she appeared in their homes. They saw her on their television screens. They heard her voice. They watched her introduce programs. They watched her discuss crimes. But they did not know what she was thinking while she drove home. They did not know what she had been talking about with Alan Farthing. They did not know what she planned to do later that evening. They did not know what she had bought that morning. They did not know what she was looking forward to. That private world belonged to Jill and the people closest to her. And then, in a matter of seconds, it was taken away. The public Jill would survive in photographs. The private Jill would survive in memory. This distinction will become increasingly important after her murder, because when someone famous dies violently, the public often feels as though they have lost someone they knew. But the people closest to the victim lose something different. They lose the person who called them, the person who knew their jokes, the person who remembered birthdays, the person who could walk through the door without anyone needing to explain who they were. For Jill's family and friends, there was no mystery surrounding the value of her life. There was only an absence, and that absence began at Gowan Avenue. The house itself had been part of Jill's ordinary life. It was not a place she expected to become famous. It was not a stage. It was not a studio. It was simply home. And perhaps that is why the location became so psychologically powerful. The murder had not happened somewhere Jill had chosen to take a risk. It had happened at the place where she was supposed to be safest. There is a particular vulnerability in the final approach to front door. A person has already completed the journey. The destination is visible. The mind begins to switch from the outside world to whatever comes next. Keys are taken out. Attention narrows. The body moves almost automatically. People who live in the same house can recognize this behavior. They know what it looks like when someone arrives home. The car slows. The engine stops. The door opens. Footsteps. Keys. A hand reaches toward the lock. These actions are so familiar that we perform them without thinking. For Jill, that sequence ended before the door could become a barrier. And that raises a disturbing question. Did the killer know how Jill behaved when she came home? Was the location chosen because it was predictable? Was the timing deliberate? Or was the killer simply fortunate enough to encounter her there? Investigators would spend years trying to understand that distinction. Because if the killer had planned the attack around Jill's movements, then the murder suggested surveillance. And surveillance requires something. Time. Patience. Information. Someone would have needed to know where Jill was likely to be. But if the murder was opportunistic, then the explanation could be very different. Perhaps the killer had no elaborate knowledge of her life. Perhaps he was already nearby. Perhaps the encounter was shorter and more accidental than investigators initially believed. The physical scene could not answer all of those questions. A pavement does not tell a story. A doorway does not explain why someone was standing there. A car parked nearby cannot reveal who was watching from inside. The investigators had to build the story from human testimony. And human testimony has limits. A witness may remember a person's height, but not their face. They may remember a coat, but not the trousers. They may remember someone standing still, but not know why. They may remember a face only after being told that the person they saw was a suspect. These are the complications that hide inside apparently simple eyewitness evidence. And the Jill Dando investigation would eventually contain many such complications. The more investigators searched, the more people came forward. The more people came forward, the more descriptions emerged. Some details overlapped. Others did not. A man, dark hair, dark clothing, a mobile phone, a possible connection to the area, a possible escape route, a possible sighting after the shooting. Each description represented a fragment. The temptation was to combine them, to imagine that every witness had seen the same person. But investigators could never assume that. A city contains strangers. People cross paths without knowing one another. Two men can wear similar clothes. Two people can have similar hair. Two strangers can take the same bus. And a witness can be completely sincere while still being mistaken. The difference between sincerity and accuracy is crucial. A witness does not need to lie to be wrong. But in a case where man's freedom may eventually depend on what other people remember, that distinction becomes enormous. The police therefore had to work through the evidence slowly. They had to ask what was known, what was suspected, what was possible, and what was merely imagined. Meanwhile, the public was doing something different. The public was searching for a story. A murder this shocking creates a psychological need for explanation. People do not like randomness. Randomness is frightening because it suggests that terrible things can happen without warning or reason. If Jill had been deliberately targeted, people could at least imagine a cause. Someone wanted revenge. Someone was obsessed. Someone was angry. Someone had a connection to her. A motive creates a sense of order. But if Jill had simply been chosen by chance, the implications were much more frightening. It would mean that fame could not protect her. Her work could not protect her. Her home could not protect her. And no one could predict who might become the next victim. That uncertainty made the search for motive especially intense. One of the first possibilities investigators had to examine was Jill's professional life. She had spent years working in television. Her career had placed her in front of millions. She was associated with programs that dealt with serious crime. Crime Watch was particularly important. The program had an unusual relationship with the British public. It asked ordinary viewers to participate in criminal investigations. A face appeared on screen. A reconstruction played. A voice described what had happened. Then viewers were asked whether they recognized something. That format had helped make Jill familiar across the country, but it also raised a troubling question after her death. Could her work have created an enemy? Could someone whose life had been affected by a case connected to Crime Watch have blamed Jill? Could a person featured in one of the program's investigations have developed a hatred toward her? Could someone have decided that the presenter herself should be punished? The possibilities were investigated. But a possibility is not evidence. And as investigators examined Jill's professional history, another reality became clear. She had been visible for years. That meant there were countless people who had seen her, people she had met briefly, people she had interviewed, people who had encountered her professionally, people who had watched her, people who may have admired her, people who may have disliked her, people who may have felt nothing about her at all. The pool of possible connections was enormous. That made the investigation harder, not easier. Imagine trying to identify one person from a crowd when you do not know what connection that person had to the victim. Was he a colleague? A viewer? A stranger? A former acquaintance? A criminal? An obsessive fan? A person with a completely unrelated grievance? Every possibility required a different investigative path, and every path consumed time. Meanwhile, Jill's funeral and memorialization were taking place in the world outside the investigation. Her death had become a national event. The woman who had spent her career helping the public look for missing people and criminals was now being mourned by the same public. People who had never met her left flowers. Viewers remembered her on television. Her colleagues spoke about her. Her family tried to grieve under an extraordinary level of attention. But grief and investigation rarely move at the same speed. Grief is personal. An investigation is procedural. Grief asks why. An investigation asks what happened. Grief remembers. An investigation reconstructs. For Jill's loved ones, every new development could reopen the wound. A suspect arrested. A new theory. A new newspaper story. A new television report. Every time Jill's photograph appeared again, the murder returned to present. The public might read a headline and move on. Her family could not. For them, the investigation was not a television story. It was the search for the person who had destroyed their future. And as the weeks passed, investigators needed something stronger than witness descriptions. They needed a connection, something that could place a particular person inside the chain of events. That was where the search began to move toward Barry George. George was not an obvious suspect in the way a person might imagine from a crime drama. There was no simple confession waiting for police. No weapon found in his hand. No eyewitness who had watched him fire the shot and immediately identified him. Instead, suspicion accumulated. His behavior attracted attention. His history attracted attention. Items associated with him attracted attention. Questions emerged about his interest in women. Questions emerged about whether he had been near Jill's home. And investigators began to examine whether some of his actions could be connected to the murder. This is the point at which the investigation becomes psychologically dangerous. A person can become suspicious long before they become provably guilty. And once investigators begin looking at someone closely, they naturally discover more about them. Everyone has strange details in their lives. Everyone has embarrassing moments. Everyone has things that can look different when removed from context. A person's possessions can appear sinister when viewed through the lens of a murder. A photograph can become suspicious. A newspaper clipping can become suspicious. An unusual interest can become suspicious. A statement can become suspicious. The question is not whether those things are strange. The question is whether they prove anything about the murder. That distinction would become central to Barry George's eventual trial. But in the early investigation, the pieces were still being collected. And then there was the possibility of firearms. The murder weapon was a critical missing link. The police needed to know what kind of gun had been used. They needed to know where it had come from. They needed to know who might have had access to it. They needed to know whether anyone connected to the investigation had experience with firearms. And above all, they needed physical evidence connecting a person to the shooting. That is why the eventual discovery of firearms discharge residue would matter so much. The particle itself was tiny. The implications were enormous. A microscopic trace could potentially bridge the gap between suspicion and physical connection. If investigators could say that Barry George had residue consistent with the material generated when Jill was shot, then the case could change dramatically. But a word consistent is not the same as proves. This distinction would be at the heart of later legal arguments. At the time, however, forensic science carried particular authority. A scientific finding feels different from a witness statement. A witness can forget. A scientist works with instruments. A laboratory produces results. Numbers appear. Particles are examined. Measurements are taken. The language sounds precise. And precision can create an impression of certainty even when the underlying interpretation remains uncertain. The jury in 2001 would eventually have to decide what that evidence meant. But the people investigating the murder in 1999 did not yet know where the evidence would lead. They were still searching. And while the investigation continued, Gowan Avenue remained physically unchanged. The pavement was still there. The houses were still there. The route to Jill's front door still existed. But psychologically, the place had been transformed. A normal residential street had become associated with murder that had shocked an entire country. For neighbors, the presence of police officers and journalists would have altered the atmosphere. A street that had once been ordinary was suddenly being examined by strangers. People wanted to know what had happened, what had been seen, who had been there, whether anyone had noticed something unusual. The ordinary became suspicious simply because a murder had occurred there. A man walking down the road might attract attention. A car parked nearby might be remembered. A stranger standing at a corner might suddenly seem important. The entire neighborhood became a landscape of possibility. And that is how murder investigations change places. The physical world remains the same, but its meaning changes. A doorway is no longer just a doorway. It is where the victim was attacked. A road is no longer just a road. It may be the escape route. A bus stop is no longer just a bus stop. It may be where the killer disappeared. A parked car is no longer just a car. It may have been part of the story. Every object becomes capable of carrying significance, but significance must still be proven. That would be the challenge facing detectives. They had to separate the landscape of the murder from the landscape of speculation. And there was another challenge: time. Every day that passed without an arrest made the investigation harder. Memories faded. People moved. Evidence could disappear. Potential witnesses might forget. Rumors multiplied. And somewhere beyond the police investigation, the person responsible remained free. If the killer was watching the news, they would have seen the police appeals. They would have seen Jill's photograph. They would have known that investigators were looking for a man. They might have changed their appearance. They might have changed their routine. They might have thrown away clothing. They might have hidden the weapon. Or they might simply have gone back to ordinary life. That final possibility is perhaps the most disturbing. A murderer can disappear not by fleeing to another country, but by becoming ordinary. They can stand in a queue. They can take public transport. They can go to work. They can answer a telephone. They can walk through a supermarket. They can live among people who have no idea what they have done. And unless evidence eventually exposes them, there may be nothing about their appearance that tells the world who they are. For the Jill Dando investigation, that possibility remained open. The killer had not been identified, and so detectives continued searching. The search would eventually narrow. A man would emerge. The name would become Barry George. And once his name entered the case, the investigation would begin to change. The focus would move away from a faceless stranger somewhere in London and toward one particular individual. His life would be examined. His possessions would be examined. His statements would be examined. His movements would be examined. And the question would become increasingly specific. Could Barry George be the man who had been waiting outside Jill Dando's home? At first, the answer was not certain. But suspicion does not need certainty to grow. It only needs enough unanswered questions. And the more questions investigators asked about George, the more pieces seemed to appear. Some looked important. Some looked disturbing. Some looked almost meaningless. Yet together they began to form a picture. The problem was that pictures can be deceptive. A collection of details can look like a pattern even when the details are unrelated. And once a pattern forms in the mind, it becomes difficult to stop looking for confirmation. That is one of the most powerful forces in any investigation. The belief that the answer is already somewhere in front of you. You simply need to connect the dots. For Jill Dando's investigators, the dots were beginning to connect around Barry George. But one crucial question remained. Was the picture they were creating a portrait of a murderer? Or was it the portrait of a man who happened to look suspicious after a terrible crime had occurred? The answer would determine the course of his life. It would also determine how the public understood Jill's murder. And eventually, it would bring the case into a courtroom where every detail would be placed under a much harsher light. But before that happened, investigators still had to build their case. They needed more than a suspicious man. They needed evidence. Something physical. Something that could survive cross-examination. Something that could take them from a residential street in Fulham to the person who had fired the fatal shot. They believed they had found it. It was so small that it could almost disappear between the fibers of a jacket. Yet that tiny trace would eventually carry the weight of a murder conviction. And the strange thing about the story is that the smaller the evidence became, the larger its consequences became. A particle, a jacket, a gun, a dead woman, a suspect, and eventually a courtroom. The path from one to the other would take years. But it began in a quiet London neighborhood with a woman returning home. Jill Dando had spent her life moving between public and private worlds. On television, she belonged to everyone. At home, she belonged only to herself and the people she loved. On April 26, 1999, someone crossed that boundary. They did not need to enter her home. They only needed to wait outside it. And as investigators began reconstructing those final minutes, one possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. The killer may not have stumbled upon Jill. The killer may have been waiting for her. If that was true, then somewhere in the hours before the shooting, a decision had already been made. A person had chosen a location. A person had chosen a weapon. A person had chosen a moment. And then when Jill arrived, that decision became irreversible. The rest of the investigation would be an attempt to travel backward from the gunshot, backward through the streets, backward through Jill's movements, backward through the witnesses, backward through the suspect, backward through the forensic evidence, until, perhaps, the person who had made that decision could finally be seen. But the closer investigators came to an answer, the more important another question would become. What if the person they had found was not the person they were looking for? That question would not be answered in the street. It would not be answered by the first arrest. And it would not be answered by the first verdict. It would take years. Years in which Barry George would be convicted of Jill Dando's murder. Years in which he would remain in prison. Years before experts would return to that microscopic particle and ask whether it really meant what everyone had believed. And by the time that question was finally asked, the setting of the original crime would already have become history. But for Jill's family, it would never become merely history, because whenever they remembered Jill, they would eventually reach the same place, Gowan Avenue, a front door, a spring morning, and the terrible knowledge that Jill had been only moments away from being safely inside. There is another way to understand what happened to Jill Dando. Instead of beginning with the murder, begin with the life that existed immediately before it. Because murder does not begin when a gun is fired. For the victim, it begins when a normal future is quietly taken away. On the morning of April 26, 1999, Jill still had a future. She had a fiancé. She had a career. She had a home. She had family. She had friends. She had commitments. She had places she intended to go. There were conversations she expected to have. There were plans she expected to keep. There was a wedding ahead of her. There were ordinary days waiting to become memories. None of those things came with a warning that they were about to disappear. That is what makes the reconstruction of Jill's final days so haunting. Every detail is ordinary precisely because Jill had no reason to believe it would become extraordinary. She woke. She dressed. She left. She traveled. She went about her business. She returned toward home. Nothing about those actions announced that they were the final chapters of her life. And perhaps that is how most lives end. Not with dramatic awareness that the final moment has arrived, but with someone believing there will be another morning, another telephone call, another journey, another meal, another laugh, another day. Jill believed there would be another day. She had every reason to. She was 37 years old. Her life was moving forward. Her professional career was successful. Her personal life was entering a new chapter. She and Alan Farthing were engaged to be married. For Jill, the future was not some distant abstraction. It was being actively planned. The house on Gowan Avenue was being prepared for sale. A new life was taking shape. And that makes the location of the murder even more cruel. Gowan Avenue was not supposed to be the destination of her life. It was supposed to be a temporary stop before the next chapter. Instead, it became the final address in her story. There is something almost cruelly symbolic about that. A woman preparing to leave one home. For another was killed at the doorway of a home she was about to leave behind. She had spent the morning moving toward her future, and someone was waiting to end it. The public would later see the murder as a puzzle. But Jill would never have experienced it that way. There was no mystery for her, no investigation, no theory, no courtroom. There was simply a moment when an ordinary world suddenly became dangerous. And then there was no more Jill. That is why the setting matters. The location was not simply a place where evidence was found. It was the boundary between the life Jill knew and the life she would never have. Outside the house was London. Inside was the private world she expected to return to. And somewhere between the pavement and the door, that boundary was broken. The killer did not need to follow Jill deep into her private world. They did not need to enter her bedroom. They did not need to confront her family. They only needed a few seconds. That fact would make the murder especially disturbing for the people living nearby. Because if someone could be attacked at their own front door, then the idea of home as a sanctuary suddenly became fragile. The attack also created a peculiar relationship between the street and the murder. Gowan Avenue was not a place Jill had chosen for an encounter. It was not a location associated with danger. It was simply where she lived. The killer turned an ordinary piece of London into the final scene of Jill's life. And then the street returned to normal. That is another uncomfortable truth about murder scenes. They do not remain frozen forever. Police tape comes down. Investigators leave. Photographers go. Reporters move on. People return to work. Cars return to the road. The pavement is cleaned. The weather changes. Seasons pass. The physical scene continues without the person who was killed there. But for those who love the victim, the location can remain permanently altered. A street corner can become a memory. A doorway can become an image. A particular route can become impossible to travel without remembering what happened. The world continues. Memory does not. And Jill's death would leave a particularly powerful memory because of the person she had been before the murder. She was already part of Britain's visual landscape. Millions had seen her face. Millions had heard her voice. She had entered people's homes through television screens without ever physically entering those homes. Her career had made her familiar in a way that few people achieve. But fame can also create the illusion that a person is somehow protected by being known. If millions of people know your face, surely someone would notice if something happened to you. If you are a familiar television personality, surely your death would bring immediate answers. If you work for BBC, surely the resources to find your killer will be enormous. All of those things were true in one sense. The investigation was enormous. The public attention was enormous. The police response was enormous. But none of those things guaranteed an answer. The size of an investigation does not guarantee its accuracy. The amount of evidence does not guarantee that the right evidence will be found. And public attention does not guarantee justice. Sometimes a case becomes larger and larger, while the truth remains frustratingly small. That was what happened here. The investigation would generate enormous amounts of information, but the decisive question would eventually come down to what certain pieces of evidence actually meant. Before that happened, however, investigators had to understand Jill. Who was she? What did she do? Who did she know? Who might have had a reason to harm her? What did her daily life look like? What kind of person would have wanted to approach her? And was there anything in her life that could explain why someone would choose her? These were not merely questions about the victim. They were attempts to understand the killer. Because sometimes the victim's life contains the map to the motive. Investigators examine relationships because murder is often personal. They examine work because professional conflicts can create enemies. They examine routines because routines can reveal opportunity. They examine correspondence because threats may hide in messages. They examine telephone calls because relationships can change. They examine friendships because secrets can exist behind familiar faces. They examine strangers because sometimes the killer has no obvious connection at all. For Jill, all of those possibilities had to be considered. Her public profile made the search wider. Her professional work created possible connections. Her personal relationships created others. And her visibility meant that an unknown stranger could know much more about her than she knew about him. That last possibility would remain especially troubling. Jill could recognize hundreds of people from her professional life, but she could not recognize every person who recognized her. A viewer could know her name. A stranger could know where she worked. A person could know her face from television. Someone might know where she lived. Someone might even know the sort of car she drove. None of that would mean that person was dangerous. Most people who recognize public figures are harmless. But investigators could not ignore the possibility that one person might have crossed a line between admiration and obsession. That possibility would later draw attention toward the psychological dimension of the case. What happens when someone becomes emotionally attached to a person who does not know they exist? What happens when a television image becomes more real in someone's imagination than the actual human being? What happens when admiration becomes entitlement? These questions belong to the psychology of stalking and obsession, but in Jill's case, they could not simply be assumed. There had to be evidence. And that distinction is critical. The fact that a famous woman could theoretically have a stalker does not mean she was killed by one. The fact that someone might have been obsessed with her does not identify the killer. The fact that Crime Watch dealt with criminals does not prove that one of those criminals retaliated against Jill. Every theory had to be tested. Every possibility had to be separated from fact. That is what investigators were attempting to do while the public waited. But waiting is difficult for a public that had been frightened. People wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe that the killer would be found. They wanted to believe that Jill's death had a reason. And perhaps most of all, they wanted to believe that the world still made sense. If the killer could be identified, then the danger could be contained. If the killer had a motive, then the murder could be understood. If the killer was caught, then the story could end. But none of those things happened quickly. The investigation continued. The theories multiplied. And somewhere in that process, a man named Barry George would come into focus. The significance of that name would not become apparent immediately. At first, He was simply another individual whose behavior and background attracted police attention. But the closer investigators looked, the more material they found that seemed unusual. There were photographs. There were publications. There were questions surrounding his interest in women. There were questions about his possible movements. There were details that investigators believed could place him within the broader story. Each detail seemed to answer something, and yet none answered the central question by itself. Did Barry George shoot Jill Dando? That was the question that mattered. Not whether he was strange. Not whether he was socially awkward. Not whether he behaved in ways other people found unsettling. Not whether he had an unusual interest in women. Not whether he had been somewhere near the area. Not whether he owned something that seemed suspicious. The question was whether he had killed Jill. The difference between those questions would eventually become crucial, because a courtroom cannot convict a person merely for being unusual. It needs evidence connecting that person to crime, and investigators believe that connection existed. The first major legal battle over that connection would come from forensic evidence. A microscopic particle of firearms discharge residue was found in the pocket of a jacket associated with George. The particle was tiny. The conclusion drawn from it was not, if the particle had been deposited when George fired the murder weapon, then it could be powerful evidence. If it came from some other source, its meaning would be dramatically different. The entire question therefore depended on interpretation. Where did the particle come from? What exactly could it prove? What could it not prove? How distinctive was it? Could contamination have occurred? Could a similar particle come from another source? Those questions would not dominate the early days on Gowan Avenue. At the crime scene, investigators were dealing with something much more immediate. A woman was dead. Her family needed answers. The public wanted a killer, and the police needed to find one. The scientific debate would come later, much later. For now, the investigation still had to move forward, and so did the life of the city around it. London did not pause for Jill. People still woke the next morning. Buses still traveled. Shops still opened. The BBC still broadcast. New programs appeared on television. The news cycle moved from one story to another. But Jill's face remained. Her death was too shocking to disappear quickly. The woman who had helped the public search for criminals had become the subject of a national search for her own killer. Her colleagues had to continue working in a world without her. Her friends had to hear her name spoken by strangers. Her family had to watch the investigation unfold publicly. Every theory about Jill's death was also a theory about her life. Every time a newspaper suggested a motive, it suggested something about who she had been. Every time investigators examined one of her relationships, her private life was pulled into public view. This is one of the hidden costs of a high-profile murder. The victim loses not only their life, they lose privacy. After death, strangers examine their relationships. They examine their habits. They examine their photographs. They examine their past. They search for secrets. They search for enemies. They search for anything that might explain why this particular person was chosen. In doing so, they can forget that the victim did not choose to become part of the investigation. Jill's life was not a mystery before she died. It was simply a life. A successful life. A busy life. A human life. The murder transformed it into evidence. Her home became evidence. Her movements became evidence. Her possessions became evidence. Her relationships became evidence. Her career became evidence. Even the ordinary things she had done that morning became part of the reconstruction. That is one reason the case became so psychologically powerful. It was not just a search for a murderer. It was an attempt to reverse engineer the final moments of a human life. Investigators had to walk backward, from the gunshot to the doorway, from the doorway to the street, from the street to the route, from the route to the morning, from the morning to the people around Jill, and eventually from those people to one man. But walking backward through a life is dangerous, because hindsight makes ordinary details look meaningful. Once you know that a person was murdered, every detail before the murder can seem like a clue. The journey becomes suspicious. The timing becomes suspicious. The location becomes suspicious. The person seen nearby becomes suspicious. The object left behind becomes suspicious. But before the murder happened, those details were simply life. Jill did not know she was walking through a sequence that would later be studied by detectives. She was not acting like a woman who knew danger was approaching. She was simply going home. And that may be the most important image to hold on to. Not the courtroom, not the prison, not the forensic laboratory, not Barry George. Jill, driving through West London, returning to a home she expected to enter, thinking about a future she expected to live, the city around her continuing as normal, and somewhere ahead unseen was the person who would take that future away. By the time Jill reached Gowan Avenue, the pieces were already in motion. Whether the killer had planned the attack or merely seized an opportunity remains one of the questions that gives the case its enduring uncertainty. But there is no uncertainty about what happened next. Jill arrived. She approached her home. A man came close. A gun was fired. Jill was killed. The attacker left. And within moments, the future she had been planning became the past. For the investigators, those moments would become a timeline. For the newspapers, they would become a headline. For the public, they would become a mystery. For Jill's family, they would become a wound. And for the person responsible, if that person was ever identified, they would become the moment that divided their own life into before and after. The investigation that followed would eventually consume years. It would move from Gowan Avenue to police stations, from police stations to forensic laboratories, from laboratories to courtrooms, from a conviction to an appeal, from an appeal to a retrial, and finally, back to the same unanswered question: who killed Jill Dando? But before that question can be pursued, there is another question that deserves to be asked. Who was Jill before she became a victim? Because if we begin with a gunshot, we risk allowing the murder to become the most important thing about her. It was not. The murder was only the final event in a life that had begun decades earlier. There was a little girl before there was a television presenter. There was a daughter before there was a household name. There was a young woman discovering what she wanted to do. There was a journalist and broadcaster building career. There was a friend, a sister, a colleague, a partner, a woman preparing to marry. There was a Jill who existed long before the newspapers printed her photograph beneath the words murder investigation. And understanding that Jill is essential because a victim should never be reduced to the way they died. The most important part of Jill Dando's story is not the bullet. It is the life that existed before it. So as the investigation begins to move deeper into her world, the image of Gowan Avenue fades into the background. The police tape disappears. The questions about escape routes temporarily fall silent. The streets of Fulham become distant, and we travel backward, not toward the killer, but toward the woman, toward Jill before the headlines, toward the voice behind the television image, toward the ambitions, relationships, and choices that shape her life, toward the person millions thought they knew. Because before Jill Dando became the center of one of Britain's most controversial murder cases, she was simply Jill. And that is where her story truly begins. Before Jill Dando became the woman at the center of one of Britain's most enduring murder mysteries, she was a girl from Weston-super-Mare who wanted to work in television. That ambition had been there remarkably early. She was born on November 9th, 1961, in Weston-super-Mare, the seaside town in Somerset, where she would spend much of her childhood. There was nothing about the beginning of her life that suggested she would one day become one of the most recognizable faces on British television. In fact, the first chapters of her story were marked not by fame, but by uncertainty. As a baby, Jill was diagnosed with a hole in her heart. It was a serious condition. She underwent major surgery when she was only 3 years old. For her family, the fear must have been enormous. A small child, a major operation, and the possibility that the future everyone imagined for her might never arrive. But Jill survived. She recovered. Years later, the little girl who had once been seriously ill would become a woman whose career depended on energy, travel, and an almost relentless ability to keep moving. There was something almost symbolic about that transformation. The child whose health had once made the future uncertain grew into someone who seemed determined to fill that future with as much life as possible. She was not born into television royalty. She did not come from a family of celebrities. Her connection to journalism was much more ordinary. Her father, Jack Dando, worked as a compositor at the local newspaper, the Weston and Somerset Mercury. Her older brother Nigel would also go into journalism. So newspapers were part of the family landscape. Words, deadlines, printing presses, reporters coming and going, local stories, the rhythms of a newsroom. Perhaps television seemed distant, glamorous, almost impossibly large. But Jill was interested in it. She wanted to be part of that world. As a teenager, she was involved in her local community and eventually became head girl at Broad Oak Sixth Form Center. There was ambition there, but it was not the loud, self-promoting kind. Those who later described Jill often returned to the same qualities: warmth, professionalism, modesty, an ability to make people feel comfortable. She was not the sort of television personality who seemed desperate to occupy every inch of the screen. She did not need to dominate a room. She could simply stand there and speak. And people listened. That ability would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of her career. But before national television, there was local journalism. Jill's route into the profession began with an essay. She wrote about her thoughts on the year 2000, a subject that at the time seemed far away enough to feel almost futuristic. The essay helped her obtain a position at the Weston and Somerset Mercury. She began working as a reporter. It was a modest beginning. No national audience. No television studio. No famous colleagues. Just a young woman learning the mechanics of journalism. There were stories to chase, questions to ask, people to interview, copy to write, deadlines to meet. And somewhere inside those ordinary tasks, Jill was learning the craft that would eventually make her famous. Journalism teaches a particular way of looking at the world. You learn to notice details. You learn to ask why. You learn to listen when someone else is speaking. You learn that the most important part of the story is sometimes hidden behind an ordinary sentence. And you learn to walk into unfamiliar rooms and make strangers talk to you. Those skills would later become visible on television. But at the beginning, Jill was simply a local reporter trying to establish herself. She spent several years at the newspaper. Then came the move that changed the direction of her career. In 1985, she joined BBC Radio Devon. Radio required something different from newspapers. There was no printed page to hide behind. The voice became the instrument. Listeners could not see the presenter. They had to trust the sound of the person speaking to them. Jill proved capable of making that transition. She presented the breakfast program. Then came television. She moved to BBC Southwest's regional news program, Spotlight. This was a kind of environment in which broadcasters learned their craft before moving on to the national stage. The work demanded discipline. Television does not wait. A reporter has to prepare. The camera arrives. The presenter speaks. The story moves forward. There is no comfortable pause while someone searches for the perfect sentence. Jill adapted. She was becoming a television professional. And then, in 1988, London came calling. She was 26. The young reporter from Weston-super-Mare moved into the national spotlight. She began presenting BBC Breakfast News. That was the moment when Jill Dando stopped being a local broadcaster and started becoming a national one. The scale changed. The audience changed. The pressure changed. The number of people watching changed dramatically. A mistake on regional television could embarrass a presenter. A mistake on national television could be seen by millions. Jill seemed to understand that. She developed a style that was controlled without being cold, professional without becoming mechanical, warm without appearing artificial. That combination would eventually become her trademark. She could deliver serious information while maintaining a sense of human connection. And audiences responded. By the early 1990s, her career was accelerating. She moved beyond news. She became associated with the BBC's travel program Holiday. The show took her around the world. Hotels, airports, resorts, cities, beaches, remote locations. She traveled thousands of miles for television. The contrast with her early life in Somerset could hardly have been greater. The young woman who had started by reporting local stories was now presenting programs to enormous audiences from locations around the world. Yet people who work with her often said that fame had not fundamentally changed her. That was important. Because Jill became famous at a time when television personalities were increasingly becoming celebrities. There was pressure to create an image, a recognizable persona, a lifestyle, a brand. But Jill's appeal was almost the opposite. She seemed familiar, approachable, like someone you might trust. The woman next door who happened to work on television. That quality became extraordinarily valuable. Viewers did not simply watch Jill. They trusted her. She looked directly into the camera and spoke as though she were speaking to one person. That intimacy is one of the strange powers of television. A presenter can be sitting in a studio surrounded by lights, cameras, and producers, while someone at home watches alone. Yet the viewer experiences the broadcast as a conversation. Jill understood that instinctively. She did not appear to be performing celebrity. She appeared to be doing a job. And she did that job very well. Her career eventually brought her to Crime Watch. That program would become inseparable from her public identity. Crime Watch was not entertainment in the ordinary sense. It dealt with real victims, real crimes, real suspects, real families waiting for answers. The program asked viewers to help. Someone might recognize a face, a car, a location, a piece of clothing, a distinctive behavior. The audience became part of the investigation. Jill's role required a delicate balance. She had to communicate the seriousness of crime without turning suffering into spectacle. She had to appear authoritative without becoming intimidating. She had to speak about victims while remembering that the people watching might themselves have experienced violence. And she became very good at it. Her partnership with Nick Ross became familiar to millions. By the late 1990s, Jill Dando was no longer simply a presenter. She was part of the national consciousness. Her face represented the BBC. Her voice was associated with trust. Her appearance on Crime Watch placed her in an unusual position. She was helping Britain's search for criminals. And yet there was nothing in her public persona that suggested she imagined herself as someone who could become the victim of a crime. Perhaps that is one reason her death was so shocking. The person who had spent years asking viewers to help identify criminals was suddenly the victim whose killer needed to be identified. It was an almost unbearable reversal. But Jill's life was larger than Crime Watch. She presented news. She presented travel programs. She worked on entertainment and factual programming. She was versatile enough to move between different formats without appearing to lose herself. In 1997, she was named BBC Television Personality of the Year. By then, her position was firmly established. She was one of the BBC's most successful presenters. And yet, behind the public success, there was a private life that was beginning to enter a new chapter. For years, Jill had experienced the same complicated reality that many successful people experience. A career can become stable long before personal life does. The television work was moving quickly. Her relationships had their own history. She had been involved in a long relationship with BBC executive Bob Wheaton. That relationship eventually ended after several years. Then, in 1997, Jill met Alan Farthing. Farthing was a consultant gynecologist. Their relationship developed quickly. Within months, the two were spending much of their time together. There was a difference between the Jill the public knew and the Jill Alan knew. The public knew the presenter. Alan knew the woman away from the camera. The woman who could take off the television makeup. The woman who could stop performing. The woman who could simply be herself. Their relationship became serious. And in January 1999, Alan proposed. Jill accepted. They planned to marry in September. The wedding date was September 25th. For Jill, the future was becoming concrete. There was now a date on the calendar. A ceremony to prepare for, a dress to choose, people to invite, plans to make, a home to organize, a life to build. That is why the final weeks of Jill's life are so difficult to reconcile with what happened. She was not standing at the end of a life. She was standing at the beginning of another chapter. She was 37. She had already achieved more professionally than a young reporter from Weston-super-Mare could probably have imagined, but she was still working, still planning, still developing, still taking on new projects. In the weeks before her death, she had been involved in the Antiques Inspectors. The first episode aired on the evening of April 25, 1999. Jill watched it with Alan. She had every reason to be pleased. The program was part of a future that was still unfolding. She was also working on other television projects. There were plans for a program about organ transplants. The subject had a personal resonance. Jill had undergone heart surgery as a child. The little girl who had survived a heart condition had grown into a broadcaster, preparing to examine the subject professionally. There was also work connected with policing and crime. Her career was not slowing down. It was changing. She had reached a point where she could choose the projects that mattered to her. That was important because Jill's career had never been built purely around glamour. She was interested in people, stories, real lives, the human side of events. That quality had made her effective on Crime Watch. It had also made her effective on Holiday. She could stand aside an ordinary traveler and make the viewer care about the experience. She could sit with someone affected by crime and allow their story to be heard. She did not need to make herself the center of every story. That restraint was part of her appeal. It also meant that people who met her often remembered not how famous she was, but how normal she seemed. That became especially powerful after her death. Colleagues spoke about her warmth. Friends remembered her modesty. People who had worked with her described someone who did not behave like a diva. She was successful without seeming consumed by success. She had become famous without appearing to believe that fame made her more important than anyone else. This was the Jill Dando the country thought it knew, and perhaps that was why the murder felt almost impossible to understand. What kind of person would want to kill her? Where was the anger? Where was the conflict? Where was the motive? There were no obvious answers. Jill's public image offered no easy explanation. She was not known as a controversial figure. She was not associated with political extremism. She had not built a career by attacking people. She was not publicly involved in bitter feuds. She had become famous largely by being reassuring. That did not make her immune to danger, but it made the violence feel especially senseless. And investigators would eventually have to confront that problem. If there was no obvious motive, they had to search for a hidden one. If Jill had been targeted, someone had chosen her. Why? If she had been followed, why? If the murder was connected to her work, which part of that work? If it was connected to her personal life, which relationship? If it was an act of obsession, who was obsessed with her? And if it was completely random, how had the killer managed to be waiting outside her home at precisely the moment she arrived? Those questions would eventually become central to the investigation. But there was another dimension to Jill's story that mattered. She had a family. She was not simply a television personality who belonged to the public. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister. She was part of a family that had already experienced loss. Her mother, Jean, had died from leukemia in 1986 when Jill was 24. That loss had come while Jill was still building her career. It was a reminder that even a successful life could be interrupted by tragedy. Her father remained in Weston-super-Mare. Her brother Nigel became a journalist as well. The family had its own history in journalism. There was a connection running through generations. The local newspaper that had been part of Jill's professional beginning was also part of her family's story.